Tonight, picture two rivers moving through the dark. They come down out of cold mountains far to the north, and they run south together across a flat country of silt and reed and pale dust, and where they finally slow and spread and lose themselves in the marshes near the sea, they made, a very long time ago, the first cities that anyone on this earth ever built. It is night there now, in the picture we are making. The water is black and slow and warm. The reeds stand higher than a man, thousands upon thousands of them, and the wind moves through them with a sound like a long breath being let out. There are frogs somewhere, and the small splash of something turning over in the shallows, and far off, on a low rise above the floodplain, there is a stepped mountain of mud brick with a fire burning at the top of it. One small orange point of light held up against an enormous sky. That fire is a lamp in a house, and the house belongs to a god, and the god has a name, and a city, and a family, and a great many opinions about how the world should be run. Tonight we are going to tell you the whole story of that god, and of the 6 others who stood closest to him, and of the people who built those houses of brick and kept those lamps burning for 3,000 years. This is the entire story of the Anunnaki, the great gods of Sumer. It is a story about the 7 who mattered most, and we will name them all before we are very far in, so that you can hold them loosely and let them go again. The Sky Father who was so high above the world that he could barely be reached. The Storm Lord who handed out kingship and took it away again. The Clever One who lived in the sweet water under the ground. The Mother of the stony ground who shaped the first people out of clay. The Moon who measured out the months. The Sun who saw everything and judged it. And the restless Queen of the morning and evening star who wanted heaven and earth and the underworld too, and very nearly got all 3. Before we begin though, let us make you comfortable, because the story is long and it is not going anywhere, and there is no part of it you need to keep hold of. Settle back now into whatever quiet place you have made for yourself tonight. Let the pillow take the entire weight of your head, all of it, so that your neck has nothing left to carry. Let your shoulders come down from wherever the day has been holding them, 1 slow inch, and then another. Unclench your jaw. Let your hands go soft and open. Let your breath find its own slower rhythm without you steering it at all, a little longer on the way out than on the way in. There is nowhere you need to be between now and morning, and nothing whatsoever that you need to solve. If you enjoy these long, slow journeys through the ancient world, and only if you genuinely do, you are very welcome to leave a like on this video and to subscribe, because it quietly helps these stories find the other people who are awake at this hour and need them. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments before you drift. It is a small and strangely comforting thing to scroll through those in the morning and see all the other sleepless people who are keeping watch with you in the dark, in cities and towns scattered right across the turning world. But there is no hurry even for that. For now, simply let the words go past you like the current of those 2 old rivers, and if you catch only every 3rd sentence, that is perfectly all right. The story will hold together without you. That is exactly what stories are for. So, the land first, because in this part of the world the land came before the gods, or at least before anybody wrote the gods down. Imagine a great flat plain lying between 2 rivers in the country we now call Iraq. To the north and east there are mountains, blue and cold and full of snow in the winter. To the west and south there is desert, hard and bright and empty. And in between, running down the middle like 2 long veins, are the rivers. The eastern one is quick and unpredictable, and prone to changing its mind and its bed in a single season. The western one is broader and gentler, and carries more silt. The ancient people who lived here called the plain simply the land, as though there were no other, and they were not entirely wrong, because there was nowhere else on earth quite like it. It rained almost never. In the dry months the sun came down on the mud until it cracked into plates you could lift up with one hand. Nothing grew that was not watered, and nothing was watered that a person had not first dug a channel for. And yet this was the richest ground in the world, because every spring the snow melted up in those cold mountains and came roaring down the rivers, and the rivers went over their banks and laid a new sheet of fine dark silt across the whole plain, free, every year, without being asked. Wheat grew in that silt like a rumour. Barley grew in it so well that the yields recorded on the earliest clay tablets look, to modern eyes, like exaggerations, and are not. Dates hung in heavy amber clusters from the palms along the levees. Fish crowded the channels so thickly that a man with a reed spear could feed a household. Reeds grew everywhere and could be cut and bundled and bent into houses, boats, mats, baskets, fences and animal pens, and eventually into the little wedge-shaped stylus that would be pressed into wet clay to make the first writing anywhere in the world. There was no stone here worth speaking of. There was no timber worth speaking of. There was no metal at all, not 1 ounce of it in the ground. There was mud and water and reeds and an almost embarrassing quantity of grain. And out of those 4 things, a very long time ago, some people who had no idea they were doing anything remarkable built the first cities. Now, we should be honest with you about time, because time is the strangest part of this story, and it is also conveniently the most soothing part of it. When we say that the story we are telling tonight is old, we do not mean it in the ordinary way that things are old. Consider this. The last of the great Sumerian cities was already a ruin, already a mound of collapsed brick with the wind blowing across it, already a place that local people told half-remembered stories about without knowing quite who had lived there, before the Queen of Egypt, whose name we all know, was even born. The temple lists that named these 7 gods were being carefully copied out by scribes who thought of them as unimaginably ancient, and those scribes lived closer in time to us than they did to the men who first raised the temples they were writing about. If you had stood in the greatest of these cities on its greatest day and asked an educated priest how old the world was, he would have told you about kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years before the flood, and he would have believed it entirely. Because the truthful answer, that his own civilization was already thousands of years deep beneath his feet, was past the edge of what any person could hold in mind. That is the scale we are working at tonight. Let it be restful rather than dizzying. It means that nothing at all that happens in this story can possibly be urgent. Every single person in it, every king and priest and farmer and scribe and soldier, every one of them finished with all their worrying an extremely long time ago, and the wind is still blowing over the mound where they lived, and the 2 rivers are still going south. Let us begin then where the Sumerians themselves would have begun, which is with water. They believed that in the beginning there was no heaven and no earth and no dry land at all. There was only a sea, not an ocean with a shore, because a shore requires land, and there was none. There was just water, everywhere, in every direction, with no top and no bottom and no edge to it, and this water was not an empty thing but a living one. And she had a name, and her name meant simply the sea. Out of that first sea, without help and without explanation, came a mountain. It rose up out of the water the way a sandbar rises out of a river in the dry season, and the top of that mountain was heaven, bright and hard and high, and the bottom of it was earth, dark and heavy and wide, and the 2 of them were joined together and were one single thing. This is a very reasonable thing to believe if you have grown up on a floodplain. Every year you watch the water go over everything, and every year you watch land appear again out of the water as it falls, first the high ground and then the low, mud lifting quietly back into the light. Of course the world began that way. You could see it beginning that way every spring from your own doorway. So heaven and earth were one mountain sitting in the sea, and inside that mountain, or on it, or of it, the first gods came into being. And the very first of them, the one who was heaven itself, was the sky. And here we meet the first of our 7. His name was An, which meant, simply and directly, sky, not the god of the sky, in the careful way we would say it now. He was the sky. The word for heaven and the word for him were the very same word, and the sign that scribes pressed into wet clay to write his name was a star, and that same star sign, placed in front of any other name, meant that what followed was a god. He was the oldest, the highest, the father, the one from whom the authority of every other divine thing eventually came down, and, in the way of very high and very old authorities everywhere, he was also almost entirely absent from daily life. People did not pray to An about their barley. They did not swear at An when the irrigation channel silted up. He was too far away for that, too vast and too impersonal, more like a fact than a person. He was invoked at the top of lists, the way a constitution is invoked, and then the actual business was conducted by others. There was a great temple of the sky in the largest city of the south, and it was old and it was honoured, but the goddess who eventually came to share that temple with him is the one people actually walked to, wept in front of, and left offerings for. That is not a criticism of An. It is simply what happens to founders. Then the mountain of heaven and earth was separated, and the separating was done by the second of our seven, and this is where the story starts to have weather in it. Between the bright hard heaven above and the dark heavy earth below there was a third thing, and that third thing was air, or wind, or breath, or the whole moving space between. The Sumerians had one word for it, Lil, and the god who was that space was called Enlil, the lord of the open air. He took hold of heaven and earth, which were joined, and he pulled them apart. He carried the sky up and away, and he took the earth for himself, and in the space between them where there had been nothing at all there was now the world as we actually experience it, room to stand up in, room for weather, room for a wind that comes across a barley field and lays the whole thing over sideways in one long green wave. So the world was opened like a hand opening, and in that opened space, in the country between the two rivers, the story of the next 3,000 years could finally begin, with people in it, and cities, and lamps burning at the tops of stepped brick mountains, and 7 great gods who each held one piece of the world, and argued a good deal about the rest. Now let us come down out of the sky and put our feet on that new ground, because the first thing the Sumerians built there was not a palace and not a wall. It was a room. A single small room of mud brick, standing on a slightly raised platform of packed earth, in the marshes at the very bottom of the plain, close to where the rivers went into the sea. Inside the room there was a low bench of brick against one wall, and on the bench there were offerings, and in the middle of the floor there was a place where things were burned. That is all. It was perhaps 4 paces across. The people who built it were fishermen and reed cutters, and they made it out of the only material they had, which was the mud they were standing in, cut into blocks and left in the sun to harden. The place was called Eridu, and by the reckoning of the Sumerians themselves, it was the first city in the world, the place where kingship came down from heaven for the first time. Here is the part that is genuinely astonishing, and I want you to hear it slowly, because it is the sort of fact that is better absorbed than examined. That little mud room was rebuilt, and when the rebuilt one wore out, it was rebuilt again, on top of the ruins of the first, slightly larger, and that one was rebuilt again, larger still, on the same spot. And again. And again. Archaeologists digging down through the mound at Eridu found the temples stacked one on top of another like the layers of an onion, at least 18 of them, each one raised on the flattened rubble of the last, each one larger and finer than the one below, from a 4-pace hut of mud to a great terraced sanctuary faced with stone and reached by a monumental stair. And the whole sequence from the first small room to the last great temple took something on the order of 3,000 years. 3,000 years of people walking to the same patch of ground because their grandparents had walked to it, and their grandparents before them, and nobody deciding to stop. Nothing in the modern world has been done continuously for 3,000 years. Try, gently and without straining, to feel the shape of that. A person born in the 20th of those centuries could stand at the door of the sanctuary and know quite correctly that the god had been in this exact spot since before the memory of the world. Whatever else you think about the gods of Sumer, they had the best address in history, and they kept it. The god who lived in that room at Eridu is the third of our 7, and he is, by some distance, the most likeable. His name was Enki, which meant Lord of the Earth, though Earth here means something closer to the ground beneath the ground. He was the god of the Abzu, the sweet water under the world. This idea deserves a moment, because it is beautiful, and because it is also, in a sense, true. The Sumerians observed that the sea was salt and undrinkable, and that rain almost never came, and yet that when you dug a hole in the dry ground you found fresh water, cool and sweet, sitting there patiently in the dark. Where did it come from? Clearly there was a second sea underneath the world, a sea of sweet water, entirely separate from the bitter one, and the marshes and springs and wells were the places where it came up to the surface and could be reached. That underworld ocean was the Abzu, and Enki lay in it, in a house whose foundations were water, dreaming and thinking and occasionally being woken up by other gods with problems they could not solve. He was the cleverest of them all, and cleverness, in Sumer, was not a small or a merely amusing quality. Enki was the god of everything that had to be invented rather than merely endured. Irrigation and brick-making, ploughs and boats, weaving and metalwork, brewing, medicine, incantation, writing, and above all the arts of ruling and of being a decent person, which the Sumerians grouped together in a wonderful concept called the me. We will come back to the me later tonight, because a great deal of trouble comes out of them, but for now hold this: the me were the roughly 100 separate things that had to exist in order for civilization to work. Kingship was one. The priesthood was one. Truth was one. So were lies. So were the making of decisions, the art of the scribe, the craft of the smith, the craft of the leatherworker, weapons, music, sexual love, the extinguishing of fire, the kindling of fire, weariness, victory, counsel, and the perceptive ear. They were not virtues. They were more like the parts in a machine or the settings on an instrument, and someone had to hold them, and it was Enki who held them, down in the sweet water, in the dark, in the house whose walls were the sea. If Enlil was the god you feared, Enki was the god who got you out of it, usually by being technically obedient and morally disobedient at the same moment. He is the one who warns the man to build the boat. He is the one who slips the secret through the wall. He is the one who, when the gods make a rule too harsh to live under, finds the crack in it. Every civilization eventually invents a figure like this and loves him more than it admits, and Sumer got there first. Beside him stands the fourth of our 7, and she is older than all of it, older even than the idea of a city. Her name comes to us in many forms, because she was worshipped for so long and across so many places that she gathered names the way a river gathers silt. But the name we will use tonight is Ninhursag, which means the Lady of the Stony Ground, the Lady of the Foothills. She was the Great Mother, not mother in the soft sense, but mother in the sense of the one who makes, the one whose hands do the shaping. Her older names include one that means simply the Lady of Birth, and another that means womb, and she was the goddess to whom the making of living things belonged. In the oldest lists of the great gods she stands with the Sky Father, and the Storm Lord, and the Lord of the Sweet Water, the fourth of the 4, and in more than one story it is her hands, working the clay that Enki has pinched from the top of the Abzu, that make the first human beings. That is the older and gentler version of how people came into the world, and it is worth pausing on. In the Sumerian telling, the gods had been doing all the work of the world themselves, digging the canals, hauling the baskets of earth, keeping the rivers open, and after a very long time of this they became exhausted and they complained, loudly, the way anyone does at the end of a bad season. And in the version where Ninhursag is central, the answer is not punishment and not war. The answer is craft. Enki says, in effect, there is a solution to this, and it is lying under the water where I sleep, and the mother goddess takes the clay, and she pinches off pieces of it, and she shapes them, and the shapes stand up and take the baskets out of the hands of the gods and go down to the canals, and from that day the world is worked by people, and the gods are free to be worshipped. Human beings, in this account, are not a mistake, or a fall, or a rebellion. They are a labour-saving device made by two competent professionals, and everything that follows, all the temples and hymns and offerings, is essentially the terms of employment. There is even a scene, half comic and half unsettling, in which the two makers sit down and drink together, and grow merry, and begin making people badly on purpose to see whether the other can find a use for the ones that come out wrong. The one who cannot bend the fingers, the one who cannot hold urine, the barren woman, the person who is neither man nor woman. And each time Enki finds a place, the one who cannot bend the fingers becomes a servant of the king. The barren woman is given a position in the temple household. The one who is neither becomes a servant standing before the king. It is a strange passage, and people have argued about it for 100 years. But there is something in it that is unmistakably kind underneath the wine, whatever comes out of the clay. There is a place for it in the city, and the city is arranged so that it fits. Now we have 4 of our 7, the sky, the wind, the sweet water, and the shaping hands. That is the older quartet, the 4 whose names come first in the earliest god lists, the 4 who between them account for the whole vertical world, from the star sign at the top to the water in the well at the bottom. But no one lives in a vertical world. People live in a world with days in it, and months, and law, and desire, and it is the last 3 of our 7 who hold those. And they are not by coincidence. A family, a father, and his 2 children born the same, one of them the moon, one of them the sun, and then the daughter who would not stay in the place she was given. Their story begins badly, and we will tell it plainly and without lingering, because it is not a comfortable one, and it does not need to be dwelt on. The Lord of the Open Air, walking in the city that was his, saw a young goddess bathing in the river and took her against her will. The other great gods, when they learned of it, did not shrug. They seized him, and they judged him, and they cast him out of the city and sent him down out of the bright world into the land below, which is the only story in all of Sumerian literature in which the most powerful god on earth is arrested by a court and exiled for a crime. That is worth noticing. These were not gods who stood outside the law. The law in Sumer was older and heavier than any single divine person, and even the storm could be put out of doors for breaking it. She followed him down, and in the darkness below she bore his child, and then, by a piece of divine bargaining that got all of them out again, the child was brought back up into the world. And that child was the moon. The 5th of our 7 was called Nana, and later in the north Sin, and he was the moon. He lived in the city of down in the south near the old shoreline, and his temple there became in time the most magnificent thing in the country. Think for a moment about what the moon meant to people who had no clocks and no calendars and no printed almanacs. The sun is splendid, but the sun tells you almost nothing. It comes up, it goes over, it goes down, and it does the same thing tomorrow. The moon is the one that keeps count. It thins to a bright fingernail in the west after sunset, and swells night by night until it comes up round and orange over the reeds at the very moment the sun goes down, and then it wears away again on the other side, and the whole cycle takes 29 or 30 nights, and it never once misses. Every month in the Sumerian year began on the evening when the new crescent was first sighted low in the west, and a month was called, quite literally, a moon. Every festival, every rent day, every date on which a debt fell due or a field had to be watered, or a boat had to sail, hung off the moon. He was, in the most practical possible sense, the god who made time countable, and so he was the god of counting itself, and of the herdsman's tally. Because the standard image of him is a herdsman, the crescent is the horns of a bull, and the stars of the sky are his cattle, and he walks them slowly across the black pasture from one horizon to the other, all night, every night, without hurrying, without ever losing one. If you are the sort of person who lies awake counting things, That image is yours tonight. Somebody is out there in the dark, walking a very large and very calm herd from east to west, and he has been doing it for a long time, and he does not need your help. The moon had 2 children who were born together. The 6th of our 7 was the son, Utu, who was the sun. And he lived in 2 cities at once, Sippa in the north and Larsa in the south. And every morning the great gates of the eastern mountain were opened for him by 2 guardians, and he came up out of them with rays standing from his shoulders like blades. And every evening the gates of the western mountain closed behind him. And in the hours between he crossed the whole visible world at the pace of a slow king. Now the interesting thing about the Sumerian sun god is what he was for. He was not chiefly a god of warmth or of harvest or of life, which is what you might expect. He was the god of justice, and the reason is completely logical, and it is the sort of logic that only occurs to people who live under a sky like that one. The sun sees everything. There is nowhere on the whole plain, from the mountains to the marsh, that he does not look at directly every single day. No wall is high enough to hide a thing from something that stands over the top of the world at noon. Therefore he is the witness. Therefore he is the one you swear by, the one before whom contracts are sealed and oaths are taken, the one to whom the wronged person cries out when there is nobody left to appeal to. There are Sumerian and Babylonian prayers, scratched into clay by ordinary people, that begin by reminding him that he is the judge of the oppressed, and the one who gives light to the poor man who has no protector, and then gets straight to the complaint. He rides over the world seeing, and he is expected to do something about what he sees. And when a king of that country carved the most famous law code of the ancient world onto a black stone pillar, he had himself shown at the top of it, standing in front of the seated sun god, receiving the rod and the ring, which were the measuring tools of a builder, because law was understood as a kind of straightness, a thing you could check with an instrument. And then there is the 7th, the daughter. She was born the same as her brother the sun, and she was the star that hangs bright and low in the west after sunset, and bright and low in the east before dawn, the star that is not really a star at all. Her name was Inanna, which probably means Lady of Heaven, and later, in the north, she was called Ishtar. And there is no figure in the whole ancient world quite like her. She was the goddess of sexual love, and she was the goddess of war, and the ancients saw no contradiction whatsoever in that, and if you think about it for a moment, neither will you. Both are appetites. Both overturn the ordinary order of a life. Both are things that come over a person suddenly and change what they are willing to do. The hymns to her say that she turns a man into a woman and a woman into a man, that she confuses and confounds, that battle is her dance and the din of weapons is a banquet to her, and in the same breath they call her the one whose bed is sweet and whose lap is a garden. She was young, and she was magnificent, and she was completely without patience, and the entire second half of her legend consists of her going somewhere she has been told not to go, and taking something she has been told is not hers. Her city was Uruk, on the eastern branch of the great Western River, the largest city in the world for a very long time. The place where writing was invented, and where the wheel and the plough and the cylinder seal all appear early. The city of the hero king whose story became the oldest long poem that survives anywhere. And her temple there was remarkably the temple of the Sky Father, the house of heaven, which she came to share and then, in a way we will get to, came to own. So there they are, all 7 of them, and now you have them. An, the sky, oldest and highest and furthest away, Enlil, the open air, the storm, the one who separated heaven from earth and who hands out kingship. Enki, the sweet water under the world, the clever one, the inventor, the one who finds the crack in the rule. Ninhursag, the lady of the stony ground, the shaping hands, the mother of what is made. Nanna, the moon, the herdsman of the stars, the keeper of the count. Utu, the sun, the one who sees everything and is therefore the judge. And Inanna, the evening and morning star, love and war, the one who will not stay put. Those are the 7 who decree the fates, the 7 who sit at the head of the assembly, and the whole enormous company of the gods beneath them, the 50 great gods and the hundreds of small ones, the gods of individual canals and particular gates and single professions, is called by one collective word. That word is the Anunnaki. It is worth being clear about the word, gently and without any fuss, because it has had an eventful modern life. In the actual clay, in the actual language, the Anunnaki are the great gods as a body, the assembly, the senate of heaven and earth. The name seems to mean something like the offspring of the Sky Father, the princely seed, and in the earliest texts they are simply the divine establishment, the ones who gather in the courtyard of the Stormlord's temple in the city of Nippur and decide what will happen. Later, as the centuries went on, the word drifted downward, and in some Babylonian texts, the Anunnaki become specifically the gods of the earth and the underworld, the ones who sit below and judge the dead, while a different word is used for the gods of the sky. But at the beginning, and for most of the long story we are telling tonight, the Anunnaki are the whole council, 7 at the top who decree, 50 great ones behind them, and an enormous quiet crowd of lesser divinities filling the hall. And what did that council actually do? It met, and it debated, and it decided. That is the striking thing. The Sumerians did not imagine heaven as a throne room with a single absolute ruler shouting orders. They imagined it as an assembly, because that is what they had. Their own cities in the very earliest days, before kings hardened into dynasties, seemed to have been run by councils of elders who met and argued and came to decisions, with a war leader appointed for emergencies who was supposed to hand the office back afterwards, and did not always. So heaven was run the same way. The gods gathered. They ate and drank first, which is recorded without embarrassment, and which every committee in history will recognize. Then the matter was put. Then the 7 who decree the fates spoke, and the 50 great gods spoke, and there was disagreement, sometimes furious disagreement, and a decision was reached, and once it was reached it was called a word, and the word could not be recalled. Their phrase for this is lovely and terrible. The word that has gone out of the mouth cannot be brought back. Not even by the God who spoke it. That was the machinery of the universe as they understood it. And now that you have met all 7 of the people who ran it, we can slow right down and spend the rest of the night walking through what they did with it, the cities they lived in, the temples that were their houses, the flood they nearly ended everything with, the kings they made and unmade, and the long, slow, quiet way in which they were finally left alone. So let us go and look at where they lived, because this is the part of the story that is easiest to fall asleep inside. A Sumerian city was not, in the way we would put it, a city with temples in it. It was a household with a city around it. The god owned the place. That was not a figure of speech, and it was not a polite fiction. The land belonged to the god, the granaries belonged to the god, the herds and the orchards and the fishing rights and the reed beds and the workshops belonged to the god, and everybody in the city. From the highest priest down to the woman grinding barley in the courtyard was in some sense a member of the god's staff. The temple was his house. The Sumerian word for temple is simply the word for house, and the great buildings were named the way you would name a family seat. The house of heaven, the house whose foundation is the Apsu, the house of the great mountain, the shining house, and a house needs to be run. So the god was woken in the morning. He was washed. He was dressed in real cloth with real jewellery, kept in a real inventory that scribes checked, garment by garment, against last year's list. He was given breakfast, and it was a substantial one. Bread, beer, meat, dates, fruit, oil, honey, milk, everything set out on tables in front of the statue in the inner room, with a curtain drawn while he ate, because it would not be decent to watch. Musicians played. Incense burned. Then the curtain was drawn back, and the food, having been eaten in the way that gods eat, which does not diminish it, went out to the king's table, and to the priests, and to the temple staff, and so the whole enormous machinery of the city was, quite literally, fed on the god's leftovers. In the evening the whole thing happened again, and then he was undressed and put to bed. Every day, every single day, for 3,000 years, in 100 cities, with the accounts written down. And it is the accounts, more than the hymns, that let us stand inside those rooms. Because here is the thing that people rarely say about writing. It was not invented for poetry, or for prayer, or for kings to boast. It was invented for the temple's books. The earliest tablets from the great city of Uruk, more than 5,000 years old, are not literature at all. They are receipts. So many measures of barley, so many jars of beer, so many sheep from this herd delivered to that official, on the account of the goddess. Somebody needed to know where the grain had gone, and human memory was not adequate to the scale, and so they began pressing little pictures into flat pieces of wet river mud with the cut end of a reed. Slowly the pictures became simpler, and the simpler shapes became wedges, and the wedges became signs that could stand for sounds rather than things. And at some point in that quiet accountant's drudgery, somebody realized that if a sign could stand for a sound, then anything at all that could be said could be written, including a poem, including a letter, including a joke. It is a wonderful thought to lie down with. The whole written world, every book you have ever loved, began as the effort of a tired man in a mud-brick storeroom trying to keep track of some sheep. And in the middle of the city, rising over the flat roofs, was the mountain. The Sumerians called it a ziggurat, from a word meaning to build high, and it is the single most recognizable thing they made. A ziggurat is not a pyramid, although it is often mistaken for one, and the difference matters. A pyramid is a tomb, it is sealed, and it is finished, and nobody is meant to go inside it again. A ziggurat is a staircase. It is solid all the way through, a vast mass of mud brick, millions of bricks, with a facing of harder kiln-fired brick set in bitumen to keep the rain out, built in 3 or 4 or 7 receding terraces, with a great triple stairway climbing the front, and at the top a small shrine. The whole colossal object exists in order to lift that little room up into the air so that heaven and earth are joined at one point, and there is a road between them, and somebody can walk up it. Stand at the bottom of one in the evening, when the brickwork is still holding the day's heat, and look up the stair. It is not built to be admired from a distance. It is built to be climbed slowly by a small number of people at particular times of the year, in silence. From the top, on the flat plain, you could see everything: the canals shining, the barley, the palm rows, the flat brown roofs of the town below, the desert edge, and the next city's ziggurat far off across the fields, a small pale block on the horizon. That is worth holding on to. From the top of one god's stairway you could see the top of the next god's stairway, and the people down below on both sides were watering the same water and burning the same reeds, and speaking the same language, and would, over the coming centuries, fight each other savagely over a boundary ditch. Around the temple, the city itself, narrow streets, and it is important to understand how narrow, barely wide enough for a laden donkey, twisting rather than straight, with blank mud walls on either side, and no windows at street level. Everything faced inward. A house of any substance was built around a courtyard, rooms on all 4 sides opening onto an open square of sky, with a drain in the middle, a stair up to the flat roof, and the whole family life happening in that bright private well of air. In the hot months everyone slept on the roof, in a row under the stars, which in that latitude and that age were the most crowded and brilliant thing anyone had ever seen. There was no glass, no electric light, no smoke but their own. Lie on a Sumerian roof in July, and the sky is not a background. It is a low ceiling of light, and the moon comes up over the reeds enormous and orange, and you can see, quite clearly, the herdsman walking his cattle. Under the floors of those houses, sometimes they buried their dead. Not always, and the practice varied a great deal by period and by place, but it happened often enough to be worth mentioning gently, because it tells you something about how they thought. The dead were not sent away. They stayed with the household, under the floor of the room where the family sat, and they were given water and a little food at the proper times by their descendants, and in return they were expected to look kindly on the house. The worst thing that could happen to a Sumerian was not death. It was to die with no one left to pour the water, to be a ghost with no descendants, wandering, thirsty, eating scraps and drinking from puddles in the street. A great many of the tender, complicated arrangements of that world, the anxiety about sons, the adoptions, the care taken over funerals, come from that single fear. And around the whole thing, the wall, every Sumerian city had one, of mud brick, thick enough at the base to drive a chariot along the top of, running for miles and pierced by gates named after the gods. And the wall was the proudest thing a king could build, and the thing he was most likely to record. The oldest long poem we have, about the king of the great eastern city, ends, after all its adventures and all its grief over death, by telling the listener simply to go and look at the wall, to examine its brickwork, to see how the courses are laid, to walk its length. That is the consolation the poem offers a man who has just discovered he is going to die. Look at the wall. Somebody built that, and it is still standing, and it will be standing after you. It is a very Sumerian kind of comfort, practical and slightly stony, and when you are lying in the dark yourself, unexpectedly warm. Now let us take the 7 one at a time and stay with each of them for a while, slowly, the way you might walk from room to room in a very large house in the evening, turning on a lamp in each one and then leaving it burning behind you. We begin at the top, with the sky. The strange thing about An is that the higher he goes, the less there is to say, and this is not a failure of the evidence, it is the point. He is at the top of every list. His name is written with the star, and the star is also the word for God itself, so that in a sense every deity in the country was written with a small piece of him at the front of their name. He is the Father who gives, the source of authority, the one in whose name the assembly is convened. And when you look for stories about him, there are almost none. He does not go on journeys. He does not fall in love, at least not in the surviving tellings, or fight monsters, or make mistakes that have to be repaired. He sits. In the great narrative poems he appears in one posture over and over, seated, listening, being appealed to, and then either granting or refusing. Somebody comes up to heaven with a complaint, and An hears it, and he either says yes, or he says that the matter is not his to decide, and it must go to the assembly, which is, if you have ever dealt with a very senior official, an extremely realistic portrait. There is a lovely and revealing moment in one poem where an angry goddess demands a monstrous weapon of him to punish a mortal who has offended her, and he tells her, flatly, that the thing she is asking for would ruin the country, and that she cannot have it, and she has to threaten to break down the doors of the underworld and let the dead out before he gives in. That is An, the one you go over the head of everybody else to reach, and the one who mostly says no, and who cannot be moved except by the threat of something genuinely catastrophic. His city was Uruk, and his house there was the house of heaven, and in the earliest times it was his alone. But over the centuries something happened that happens to a great many founders, and it happened without any dramatic quarrel that we can see. The daughter moved in. Inanna came to share the house of heaven, and then to dominate it, until by the later periods the great sanctuary at Uruk is thought of as hers first and his second, and hymns that were once his are sung to her, and he is up there somewhere above the roof, still honoured, still invoked, still the top of the list. And no longer really the point. There is a Sumerian phrase for the highest heaven, the one above the heaven of the stars, and it is said that the Sky Father lives there with the gods of the older generation, quietly, and that nobody goes up. Now come down one level, and the air changes completely, because Enlil is not a distant thing at all. Enlil is weather. His city was Nippur, in the middle of the plain, and Nippur was unlike every other city in the country in one crucial respect. It was never, as far as we can tell, the capital of anything. It had no dynasty of conquering kings. It did not try to rule the plain. What it had instead was the temple called the House of the Mountain, and the temple called the House of the Mountain was where kingship was confirmed, and so every ambitious warlord in Sumer, no matter which city he came from, eventually had to come to Nippur and stand in that courtyard and be told by the priests of the storm god that the country was now his. Nippur was the neutral ground, the place where legitimacy was kept, and its temple grew fat on the offerings of rivals who could not stand each other, but who all needed the same signature. Something in that arrangement is deeply and recognisably human, and it is one of the reasons the country held together at all. Enlil himself is a difficult character to love and an easy one to respect, and the Sumerians knew it. Their hymns to him are magnificent and slightly nervous. He is called the Great Mountain, and the Raging Storm, and the one whose word cannot be altered, and the poems say that without him no canal is dug, no field is watered, no house is built, no city is founded, no king is raised, and also that when he lifts his eyes in anger, no god can look at his face. He is the wind that brings the rain that saves the barley, and he is the wind that comes off the desert in the hot season carrying so much fine dust that the sun goes the colour of an old coin and you cannot see the far side of the courtyard, and everybody stops work and sits inside with cloth over their mouths, waiting. Both of those are the same god. That is not a contradiction that would have troubled anyone in that country. The thing that gives you your life is the thing that can take it, and you do not expect it to be nice about the arrangement. You expect it to be regular, and you make your offerings, and you keep the drains clear. In his hands, in the story that the Babylonians would later retell at enormous length, was an object that deserves a moment of your drifting attention, because it is the most purely Mesopotamian thing ever imagined. It was called the Tablet of Destinies. It was a clay tablet, not a crown, not a sword, not a jewel, a piece of writing, worn on the chest, sealed, and whoever held it held the fates, because in that country the fates were a document. The universe was administered. Things happened because they had been decreed and written down and sealed, and the seal was the proof, and if you took the tablet you did not merely become powerful, you became correct. Wars were fought in heaven over that tablet, and it was stolen at least once by a great storm bird and had to be retrieved, and the whole idea of it tells you more about how those people understood the world than any temple does. They lived by writing. Their gods did too. And it was Enlil, above all, who did the thing that the seven were most for, which was to decree. When the assembly met in the courtyard at Nippur and the word went out, it was usually his mouth it came out of. Kingship descended from heaven, the king lists say, and it descended at Eridu first, and after a very long time it was carried away and given to another city, and then another. And each time it moved because Enlil had grown weary of the last one. That single sentence, repeated dozens of times in the king lists with different city names, is the whole political theory of Sumer in a line. Power is real, and power is lent, and it is lent by the storm, and the storm changes. No dynasty in that country ever quite believed it was permanent, because their own official history told them over and over, in the flattest possible language, that it was not. And so there is a genuine strangeness in the fact that the greatest and most terrible poem they ever wrote is about exactly this happening to the greatest of their cities, and that it was written not by the enemies who destroyed the place, but by the survivors, and that it was copied out afterwards for centuries by schoolboys learning to write. We will come to that poem much later tonight, near the end, when the lamps are lower. For now let it be enough to know that they always knew. They built in mud on a floodplain in an assembly of gods who could be outvoted, under a lord of the air who got tired of things, and they built anyway. For 3,000 years, and they wrote it all down. Down now, all the way down, past the floor of the world, to the third of the seven, and this is the pleasantest room in the house. Enki lay in the Abzu, the sweet water sea beneath the ground, and his temple at Eridu was built around a pool that was understood to be an opening into it. Every great temple in the country afterwards kept a basin of water in the courtyard for exactly this reason. It was a small piece of the deep, brought up and kept indoors. Priests washed in it before entering the god's room. Water was the first and last thing in that religion, which makes perfect sense in a place where a man's whole year depended on whether a ditch stayed open. There is a long poem, one of the loveliest things they left behind, that describes Enki going out and organising the world. And it is not a poem about creation from nothing. It is a poem about administration, done well by somebody who enjoys the work. He sets out in his boat, and he goes from region to region, and in each place he decrees what the place will be, and appoints a god to look after it, and it is all extremely specific. He fills the 2 rivers with sparkling water, and stocks them with fish, and appoints the god of the reeds and marshes to keep them, a god described wonderfully as one who loves fish. He fixes the sea in its place and appoints a goddess to it. He calls the rain down and appoints the storm god of the sky. He lays out the fields and the furrows and appoints the farmer god, and then he turns and invents the pickaxe and the brick mould and appoints the brick god, and then he stretches the measuring line and lays foundations and appoints the god of building. He fills the high plain with grass and the sheepfolds with fat and milk, and appoints the shepherd. He fixes the borders and sets up the boundary stones and appoints the sun to be the judge of them. He gives the spindle and the loom to the goddess of weaving. On and on it goes, department by department, and what comes through the whole thing is not majesty, but competence, and a certain contented pleasure. Somebody is going down a list, filling posts, making sure each thing has an owner, and each owner has the tools. It is the exact opposite of a thunderous act of will, and the Sumerians clearly found it soothing, because they copied that poem for centuries. Near the end of it there is a small human moment. Inanna comes to him and complains. All the other goddesses have been given something, she says, a real function, a real office, and what has she been given? And Enki, patient, slightly on the back foot, explains at length that she has in fact been given a great deal, the shepherd's crook and staff, the power to change one thing into its opposite, the beauty of the young woman and the terror of the battlefield, the standards and the weapons and the loud instruments, and the goodwill of the assembly. It does not entirely satisfy her. Almost nothing does. And that brings us to the me, and to the best story in Sumerian literature, which is essentially a heist. Remember the me, the roughly 100 fundamental things that make civilization work, held in Enki's keeping down at Eridu. Kingship, priesthood, truth, falsehood, the art of the scribe, the craft of the metal worker, the craft of the leather worker, the craft of the basket weaver, music, weaponry, the giving of judgments, the making of decisions, wisdom, understanding, fear, dismay, strife, peace, the extinguishing of fire, the kindling of fire, the perceptive ear, and a good many more, some of which we still cannot translate confidently. They were not abstractions floating in the air, they were treated as objects, things that could be handed over, loaded onto a boat, and taken somewhere else. And Inanna wanted them for her city. So she went down to Eridu, alone, and she came to the house whose foundation is the Abzu, and Enki, hearing that she was at the door, gave the instruction that any host in that country would give. Bring her in, give her butter cakes, pour cool water, offer her beer. And then the 2 of them sat down together and drank. And they drank, and Enki, who was the cleverest being in the universe, but who was also, on this particular evening, extremely far into a jar of beer, became expansive. In the name of my power, he said, in the name of my Abzu, I will give my daughter the high priesthood, the godship, the noble and enduring crown, the throne of kingship. And she said, very politely, I take them. And he gave her more, the art of the hero, the art of power, truth, the descent into the underworld and the ascent from it. I take them, she said. And more, the standard, the quiver, the art of lovemaking, the art of the kiss, the cult prostitute, the running fast, the going quietly. I take them. 7 times he gave, and each time it was a great fistful of the fundamental machinery of the world. And each time she accepted with perfect courtesy, and by the end of the evening he had handed over the whole 100. Then Inanna loaded them all onto the boat of heaven and cast off up the river for Uruk, and Enki went to sleep. And in the morning he woke up. There is a scene here that is written with real comic precision. He looks around the room. Where is the crown? Where is the throne? Where is the art of the scribe? Where is the perceptive ear? Where is the extinguishing of fire? And his minister, whose name means two-faced and who has to be the one to say it, tells him, "Gently, my king. You gave them to your daughter, and she has left." And Enki, who does not take this at all well, sends monsters after the boat. 6 times he sends them, sea creatures and giants and enforcers of the deep, and 6 times they catch the boat of heaven at a landing place along the river, and 6 times Inanna's own minister, a resourceful woman who is the unsung hero of the entire story, drives them off. And at the 7th landing the boat comes in at Uruk, and the people of the city come out to the quay, and the me are unloaded one by one and carried into the city, and there is a festival, and the city is made complete. And Enki, arriving at last, having lost, does something that I find genuinely moving. He accepts it. He makes a peace with her, and he blesses the quay where the boat landed, and he declares that from now on the arrangement stands. The clever one loses a fair fight that he started by being generous while drunk, and he takes it in good part, and the world is better arranged afterwards than it was before. If you want to know why a civilization loved a god for 3,000 years, it is not usually the thunder. It is that. Let us stay with Enki a little longer, because the next room we walk into belongs to him and to Ninhursag together, and it is the strangest and softest place in all of Sumerian literature. It is called Dilmun. Dilmun was a real place, an island out in the warm gulf south of the marshes, a trading station where ships came in from the east carrying copper and carnelian and beads of lapis lazuli that had travelled overland from mountains thousands of miles away. Sumer had no metal and no stone, remember, so everything hard and bright in that country came up the gulf through Dilmun, and the island acquired in the Sumerian imagination the particular glow that trading ports always acquire in the minds of the people who receive their goods without ever going there. It became the pure place, the clean place, the land where things began. And a poem survives that describes it, and the description is one of the oldest pictures of paradise anyone has written down. In Dilmun, the poem says, "The raven does not croak, the lion does not kill, and the wolf does not carry off the lamb. The wild dog does not know how to eat the kid. The dove does not hang its head. There is no one there who says my eyes are sick, no one who says my head hurts, no old woman there who says I am an old woman, no old man who says I am an old man. The maiden goes out unwashed, and no one is troubled by it. No herald makes the rounds of his district. The singer sings no laments, and beside the city he utters no cry of woe. It is a description almost entirely made of things that are absent, which is exactly how anybody who has lived a hard life actually imagines happiness, not as more, but as less. No sickness, no aging, no mourning at the edge of town, no official coming down the street. And there is one more thing missing in Dilmun at the start of the poem, and it is the thing the whole poem turns on. There is no fresh water. It is clean, and it is quiet, and nothing there is dying, and it is also barren, because the ditches are dry, and the fields are unwatered, and nothing can grow. So the goddess of the island asks Enki for water, and he gives it. He brings the sweet water up out of the Abzu, and the wells fill, and the ditches run, and the fields go green, and Dilmun becomes a garden and a harbour where the great ships dock. And then, the poem does something completely unexpected. It becomes a story about a marriage, and a quarrel, and a very long and very odd reconciliation between Enki and Ninhursag, involving generations of daughters and a garden and 8 plants that he eats without permission. And when he eats the 8 plants, Ninhursag curses him, and she leaves, and she says that she will not look on him with the eye of life until he is dead, and she goes away out of the world entirely. And Enki begins to fail. One by one, 8 parts of his body sicken, in the order of the plants he ate, and the great gods sit down in the dust, because the cleverest of them is dying, and none of them knows what to do. and here comes the smallest and best character in the whole of Sumerian myth, a fox. An ordinary fox, who steps up and asks the gods what they will give him if he brings the mother goddess back. They promise him trees and honour, and a name, and he goes off, and how exactly he persuades her is lost in a broken part of the tablet, and I am rather glad it is, because the fox goes away and comes back with the great mother of the world walking behind him, and that is all we need. Then Ninhursag sits Enki down and does the thing she is for. She asks him, my brother, what part of you hurts? And he says, my jaw hurts. And she says, I have caused a god to be born for you, and the god's name is the Lord of the Jaw, and the pain is taken away. And she asks again, what part of you hurts? My tooth. And a god is born for the tooth. My mouth, my throat, my arm, my rib, my side. 8 questions, 8 births, 8 small deities of healing brought into being one by one. And each one takes a specific pain out of a specific place, and at the end of it he is well, and the quarrel is over, and the poem simply stops. There is no moral. There is no punishment. There is a fox who did the diplomacy, and a mother who asked where it hurt, 8 times, patiently, until it did not hurt any more. I do not think anyone has improved on that as an image of what healing is, and it is worth saying, quietly, that the 6th of those 8 is the rib, and that the goddess born to heal the rib has a name that puns in Sumerian on both the word for rib and the word for making live, so that she is at once the lady of the rib and the lady who makes alive. Whether that pun travelled, and how far, and into what other and much later story of a garden and a woman made from a rib, is a question that scholars have gone around for 130 years and have not settled, and we are certainly not going to settle it at this hour. Let it be a small bright thing seen out of the corner of the eye as we go past. Ninhursag herself deserves to be looked at directly before we move on, because she is the one of the 7 who has faded most in the modern imagination, and who was, for the people who actually lived there, quite possibly the closest to hand. Her names are a catalogue of the same idea approached from different sides: Lady of the Stony Ground, Lady of Birth, the Exalted Lady, the Womb, and simply, in some periods, the Mother of all the gods. Her symbol was a shape that looks like the Greek letter omega, and which is generally understood to be a stylized drawing of the uterus of a cow. And it appears on boundary stones and seals and jewellery for 2,000 years. She was the one who made kings. The standard boast of a Sumerian ruler was not that he had won a battle, but that he had been nourished by the holy milk of Ninhursag, and there are temple statues of a goddess suckling a child that were understood in exactly that way. The legitimacy of the throne shown as a mother feeding a baby. She lived, in the mythic geography, not down in the marshes with Enki, but up at the edge of the plain where the flat land begins to break into hills and rock, which is where the wild animals were, and the mines and the quarries and everything that had to be gone out and got. She was the boundary between the tended country and the country that tends itself. If Enki is the god of what is invented, she is the goddess of what is grown and born and dug out of the ground, and the pair of them together account for very nearly everything a person in that world would ever have handled. And it is those two, working together, who make the human race. There is more than one version of that story, and we should walk through the fuller and rougher one now, because it is the version that leads straight to the flood, and because it explains, in its own blunt way, what the Sumerians and the Babylonians after them thought people were actually for. It begins before there were any people at all, when the gods themselves had to do the work of the world with their own hands. The great gods sat above, and the lesser gods, the rank and file, dug, that is what the poem says, and it is very specific about the labour. They dug out the beds of the rivers, they piled up the spoil in mountains, they carried the baskets of earth. They cut the canals that watered the country, and they did it for a period the poem measures in thousands of years, and they were exhausted, and they were angry, and in the end they did something that no other ancient religion I know of has its divine beings do. They went on strike. At night, In the dark, the lesser gods set fire to their tools. They burned the baskets and the picks and the carrying frames, and then they went in a body up to the house of the Storm Lord and surrounded it. And when his minister looked out and saw the crowd around the temple and the light of the burning tools, he woke his master. And Enlil, terrified, called the assembly. It is a genuinely astonishing scene. The most powerful god in the country is barricaded in his own house at night by his own workforce, and he is frightened, and he asks the assembly who is responsible. Who started this? Who is the ringleader? And the answer that comes back from the crowd outside is that every one of them started it, all of them together, and that the work is too heavy and it is killing them and they will not go back. And when the assembly finally accepts that they mean it, the question becomes what to do, and the answer that Enki gives, sitting in his water, is the answer he always gives. There is a way through this, and the way through is to make something new. Let the birth goddess create a mortal, Enki says, and let the mortal bear the yoke, and let him carry the toil of the gods. And so the mother goddess is summoned, and she agrees on one condition, which is that she cannot do it alone. Clay is not enough. Something living has to go into the mixture, or the thing that stands up will only be a shape. So the assembly takes one of their own number, a god described as one who had intelligence, and they put him to death, and his flesh and his blood are mixed into the clay, and the whole company of the gods spits into the mixture. And the birth goddess treads the clay and pinches off 14 pieces, 7 laid on the right and 7 laid on the left, with a brick set between them. And 14 wombs are given the pieces, and after 10 months the first human beings are born. And from the flesh of the god there remains in the human being a spirit, a ghost, a something that goes on after the body stops. And the poem says, in a line that is more than 3,500 years old and still makes the back of the neck prickle, that this is how the drumbeat was established forever, the god's own heartbeat, going on inside every person, so that the dead god is never entirely quiet. That is what people are, in the older and harder telling. Clay and a murdered god's blood, made to hold a basket. And it is easy to hear that as bleak, but I would like to offer you a gentler way to hear it before you drift, because I think the people who wrote it heard it that way. It means that the work was always going to be heavy. It means that being tired is not a personal failing or a sign that you have arranged your life wrongly, it is the specification. And it also means that there is a piece of something divine and intelligent mixed all the way through the clay of you, not sitting on top of it, not added later as a reward, but kneaded in at the start, indistinguishable from the mud. You cannot get the god out of the person. That was the point of putting him in. So the people were made, and they took the picks and the baskets out of the hands of the lesser gods, and they dug the canals and cleared the silt, and raised the levees and kept the country alive, and the gods went back to being served, and everything was, for a while, exactly as intended. And then the trouble started, and the nature of the trouble is the single most interesting detail in the entire story. The people multiplied. Not wickedly, not sinfully. There is no crime here, no corruption, no violence that offends heaven. The poem is unambiguous about this, and it matters enormously. The people simply became numerous, and the land became broad, and they bellowed like cattle. The word the poem uses is noise, and it says that the god was disturbed by their uproar, that he could not lie down and sleep because of the din. And there is something almost unbearably funny and almost unbearably frightening in that at the same time. The world nearly ended because a very powerful and very tired individual could not get any rest. Now, scholars have argued for decades about what the noise really means, and there are good, serious readings in which the clamour stands for something more than volume, the pressure of a growing population on a fragile floodplain, the endless petitioning and complaining that rises from a crowded country, the sheer weight of 6 million requests going up at once. All of that is probably in there, but the surface of the text is the surface of the text, and on the surface the sequence is this. The people were made to work. They succeeded. They became many, they were loud, and the Storm Lord decided to reduce them. And he did it at first by degrees, and with a horrible bureaucratic patience. First he sent a plague, and the people began to die, and a wise man in one of the cities, a man who happened to be a servant and a favourite of Enki, went down to the water's edge and spoke to his god and asked how long this was going to last. And Enki, who cannot openly overturn a decision of the assembly, told him something clever: go to the elders and tell everyone to stop making offerings to all the other gods, and to give everything, all the bread, all the incense, all the honour, to the one God who is in charge of disease. Make him ashamed. And the people did it, and the god of disease, embarrassed by being lavished on while doing the thing he was doing, lifted his hand, and the plague ended. So the Storm Lord tried again, and this time he sent drought. He shut up the rain in the sky and the dew above, and he told the fields to give nothing. And the poem describes what a famine actually looks like in a country like that. In a series of short lines that get worse, the black fields turned white, the broad plain grew salt, the earth did not bear, vegetation did not sprout, the people's faces looked green. They went about hunched. Their broad shoulders became narrow, their long legs became short. And then, at the end of that list, the lines that the ancient scribes wrote down without any comment at all, about the 2nd year and the 3rd and the 5th and the 6th, and what a family will eat when there is nothing, and what is done with the daughter, and what is done with the door being shut against a neighbour. It is the oldest famine narrative in human writing, and it is written by people who had watched one. And again the wise man went down to the water, and again Enki found a way to slip a solution through, and again the dying stopped. And at this point the Storm Lord did the thing that turns the whole story from a series of disasters into a tragedy, which is that he worked out where the leak was. He accused Enki, in the assembly, in front of everybody, of undermining the decisions of the council. And he made every one of the gods, Enki included, swear an oath that this time there would be no warning, and no clever advice, and no crack in the rule. Because this time it was not going to be plague or drought. This time it was going to be the water. All of it, everywhere, at once. Now before we let the flood come, sit with the strangeness of what the Sumerians had done here, because it is worth a moment. They had built a religion in which the gods are not good. They are powerful, and they are necessary, and they can be magnificent, and they are also short-tempered, self-interested, capable of extremely poor decisions made late at night, and entirely willing to destroy the human race over a noise complaint. And the people who believed this did not despair, and they did not rebel. They went on feeding them twice a day for 3,000 years, and I think the reason is that this was, to them, simply an accurate description of what it is like to live on a floodplain between two unpredictable rivers under a sky that either withholds rain for a decade or drops a year's worth in a week. The powers that govern your life are not moral. They are not out to get you either. They are enormous and indifferent and occasionally catastrophic, and the correct response is not to ask whether they deserve your respect, but to keep the offerings regular, keep the levees maintained, keep your family close, and know somebody clever who lives near the water. That is not a bleak philosophy. It is a practical one. And in the middle of it, in every single version of the story, in every language it was ever retold in, there is one God who breaks his word to save people he was told to let drown. And the fact that they kept that story and copied it for 2,000 years tells you which part of it they actually loved. The flood, then, and we will take it slowly, because it is the most famous thing that ever came out of that country, and because the way it is told is even better than the fact of it. Enki had sworn an oath not to warn any human being. He kept the oath. That is the whole trick, and it is a beautiful one. He went, at night, to the house of his servant, the wise man of the city, and he did not speak to the man. He spoke to the wall. He stood outside the reed hut where the man was sleeping, and he addressed the reeds. And he said, "Reed wall, reed wall. Wall, hear me. Reed hut, Pay attention." And then he told the wall everything. "Tear down your house," he said, "and build a boat. Abandon your possessions and save your life. Give up property and keep your breath alive. Take on board the seed of all living things. Make the boat square with equal sides and roof it over the way the deep is roofed over and pitch it inside and out." And the man, lying awake on the other side of the reeds, listening to a god talking loudly to a wall in the middle of the night, understood perfectly and got up in the morning and began. The god had told no human being anything. He had merely been overheard. And there is one more piece of it, which is that the man asked what he should say to the elders of the city when they asked what on earth he was building. And the god gave him a lie to tell, and the lie is a small marvel of cruelty and craft. Tell them that the Storm Lord has taken a dislike to you, that you must leave the city and go down to the water where your own god lives, and that then, upon the land, abundance will rain down. In the morning cakes, in the evening a rain of wheat. The people helped him build it. They brought pitch and timber and rope and worked in shifts, and the man slaughtered oxen and sheep and gave a great feast for the workers as though it were a festival. And the poem says that he himself could not keep still, that he went in and out, that he sat and then stood, that his heart was broken and he was vomiting bile, and that he could not tell them, because the god's instruction and his own oath forbade it, and because there was not room for a city in a boat. That detail is not in the later, shorter, calmer retellings, and it is the detail that makes the whole thing land. He fed them dinner and let them go home. And then the weather changed. The poem describes the coming of it with a restraint that is far more frightening than any amount of thunder. At the first light of dawn, a black cloud rose from the horizon. Inside it, the storm god thundered. The gods of the deep raised the dikes, and the god who breaks the dams broke them. And the 7 judges of the underworld raised their torches, lighting the land with their glare. A stunned shock at the storm god's work passed over the sky, and everything bright turned to darkness. He shattered the land like a pot. For one whole day the tempest blew, gathering fury as it went, pouring over the people like the tides of battle. A man could not see his brother, nor could the people be seen from the sky. And then the line that turns it over, even the gods were terrified at the flood. They fled. They went up to the highest heaven, to the house of the Sky Father, and they crouched down against the outer wall like dogs. And the goddess who had made the people, the birth goddess, the mother, cried out over the noise of the water like a woman in labour and said, "How could I have agreed to this in the assembly? How could I have spoken for the destruction of my own people?" They fill the sea like fish. And the gods sat with her and wept, and their lips were parched with thirst, and they could not lift their heads. Consider what that means for a moment. The most powerful beings in existence have made a decision, and the decision is now being carried out, and they are huddled outside a door in the sky, crying, unable to look, unable to stop it, because the word that has gone out of the mouth cannot be brought back. That is the theology of that country in a single picture. Even the gods live under something they cannot revoke. 6 days and 7 nights the wind blew, and the flood came over the land. And on the 7th day the storm quieted. The sea grew calm. The wind fell. The man opened a hatch, and light fell on his face, and he looked out, and the poem says simply that all the people had turned to clay, and that the flat land was as level as a roof. And he sat down and wept, and the tears ran down his face. The boat came to rest on a mountain, and it held there, and he waited 7 days. And then he sent out a dove, and the dove went and came back, because there was nowhere for it to land. He waited and sent out a swallow, and the swallow went and came back. He waited and sent out a raven, and the raven went, and saw that the waters had receded, and ate and circled, and did not come back. And then he opened the boat to the 4 winds, and set out an offering on the mountain top. And he poured a libation, and burned cane and cedar and myrtle, and the smoke went up. And the gods, who had been huddled against a wall in the sky for a week with nothing to eat, because the offerings had stopped when the people stopped, smelled it. The line in the poem is one of the most quietly devastating things in ancient literature. The gods smelled the sweet savour, and the gods gathered like flies around the sacrificer. Like flies, not in majesty, not descending in glory. They came down onto that mountain top the way flies come to a table, because they were starving, because the whole system by which they were fed had just been drowned by their own decision. And the great mother goddess came, and she lifted up her necklace of blue lapis beads and swore by it that she would remember these days and never forget them. And she said that all the gods might come to the offering, but that the Storm Lord should not, because he brought on the flood without thinking and consigned her people to destruction. And then Enlil arrived and saw the boat and was furious and demanded to know how any living thing had escaped. And Enki stood up in the assembly of the gods and made the speech that ends the story, and it is worth hearing, because it is the first recorded argument in favour of proportionate punishment. "You are the wisest of the gods," he said. "How could you so senselessly bring about a flood? Punish the sinner for his sin, punish the criminal for his crime. But be lenient, so that he is not cut off. Be patient, so that he is not destroyed. Instead of your causing the flood, let a lion come and diminish the people. Instead of the flood, let a wolf come. Instead of the flood, let famine come. Instead of the flood, let plague strike down the people. In other words, you may thin them, and you may frighten them, and life will remain hard, but you may not end them, because ending them ends you as well." And the Storm Lord, who had been outvoted in the only way a storm can be outvoted, which is by consequences, went up into the boat and took the man and his wife by the hand and made them kneel, and touched their foreheads and blessed them, and said that until now this man was a human being, and that from this moment he and his wife shall be like us gods, and shall live far away, at the mouth of the rivers where the waters come out. And they were taken away to the ends of the earth and set down there, and they are, in that literature, still there, extremely old, extremely calm, sitting at the place where the two rivers meet the sea, which is more or less exactly where the whole story began. Now the water has gone down, and the plain is level and empty and drying in the sun. And we can turn to the seventh of the seven, the one who is left, and to the journey she made that nobody else in that whole enormous pantheon was willing to make. Inanna decided to go down. There is a phrase in Sumerian that opens the poem and repeats through it like a drum beat. From the great above she set her mind toward the great below. From the great above, the goddess set her mind toward the great below. She abandoned heaven, she abandoned earth, and she went down. And she went to the one place in the universe from which, by the plain statement of every text in that literature, no one returns. The Sumerian underworld was not a place of punishment. That idea had not been invented yet, and it is worth noticing how much lighter their picture is for the absence of it. There was no fire, no torment, no sorting of the wicked from the good. There was simply a great house under the earth, called the land of no return, where everyone went, kings and slaves alike, and where the dead sat in the dark, clothed like birds in feathers, and ate dust, and drank muddy water, unless their descendants up above poured them something better, in which case they drank that. It was dim and quiet and permanent. Nobody was being hurt. Nobody was going home. And it had a queen, and the queen was Inanna's older sister, and her name was Ereshkigal, which means the Lady of the Great Earth, and she was, of all the figures in this story, the loneliest. Why Inanna went down is not entirely clear from the poem, and the ambiguity is probably deliberate. She says that she is going to attend her sister's husband's funeral rites. Her sister does not believe this for 1 second, and neither, I suspect, did anyone listening. What she actually does when she arrives is demand entry with a great deal of noise and threaten to break down the door and let the dead out to eat the living if she is not admitted, which is not usually how one arrives at a wake. The most natural reading is the one the poem never states. She wanted it. She had heaven, and she had earth, and she had her city, and her temple, and her star. And there was one more territory, and she went to see whether she could take it. Before she left, she did one sensible thing. She dressed. The poem lists her preparations with tremendous care, and the list is important because everything on it is going to be taken off her again. The crown of the plane on her head, small lapis beads around her neck, twin egg-shaped beads on her breast, the garment of ladyship over her body, mascara called Let a Man Come, Let Him Come on her eyes, a pectoral called Come, Man, Come over her chest, a golden ring on her hand, and the measuring rod and line of lapis in her grip. 7 things. And then she told her minister, that same resourceful woman who had beaten off the monsters on the river, exactly what to do if she did not come back. Wait 3 days, then begin the lament, beat the drum in the assembly, circle the houses of the gods, tear at your eyes and your mouth, dress in a single rough garment, and go first to the Storm Lord at Nippur, and ask him to save me. And if he will not, go to the moon at and if he will not, go to the clever one at Eridu, because he knows the food of life and the water of life, and he will not let me die. Which is a remarkable thing to arrange in advance, and tells you she knew exactly what she was walking into. At the gate of the underworld she knocked, and the gatekeeper asked who was there, and went and told his queen. And Ereshkigal, hearing that her younger sister was standing at the door of her house in full regalia, slapped her thigh and bit her lip and took the matter into her heart, and then gave an instruction that is one of the coldest and most brilliant things in ancient literature. Bolt the 7 gates, she said. Open them one at a time, and at each gate take one thing off her. So Inanna went down through 7 gates, and at the first they took the crown from her head, and she said, "What is this?" And the gatekeeper said, "Quiet, the ways of the underworld are perfect, they may not be questioned." And at the 2nd gate they took the small lapis beads from her neck, and at the 3rd the twin beads from her breast, and at the 4th the pectoral, and at the 5th the golden ring from her hand, and at the 6th the measuring rod and line, and at the 7th they took the garment of ladyship from her body, and she came into the throne room of her sister naked and bowed low. And there is nothing supernatural about how that scene works. It is not magic. It is the oldest and plainest description of being stripped of office that anyone has written, rank, insignia, jewellery, tools, clothing, removed one at a time by polite officials at successive checkpoints, each of whom explains that the procedure is correct and may not be questioned. Anyone who has ever been through a slow institutional undoing knows exactly what that corridor felt like, and in the throne room the 7 judges of the underworld, the ones who had raised their torches during the flood, fixed their eyes on her, the eye of death, and spoke the word against her, the word of wrath, and she was turned into a corpse. And the corpse was hung on a hook on the wall. That is where the goddess of love and war spends the middle of her own poem, dead, naked, on a nail. In the dark, in her sister's house, for 3 days and 3 nights. Up above, the minister waited 3 days, and then did precisely as she had been told. She beat the drum in the assembly. She circled the houses of the gods. She went to Nippur, to the Storm Lord, and she wept in front of him, and asked him not to let his daughter be put to death in the underworld. And Enlil answered her exactly as you would expect the god of the storm to answer. My daughter craved the great above, she craved the great below. She who goes to the underworld does not return, and whoever has ever got the underworld and got out again. And he would not help. So she went south to to the moon, and made the same speech, and the moon gave the same answer, word for word, and would not help. And so at last she went down to the marsh, to Eridu, to the house whose foundation is the Abzu, and she made the speech a 3rd time. And Enki said, "What has happened? My daughter, what has she done? I am troubled." And he did not consult anybody. He reached under his fingernail and took out a little dirt, and he made from it a creature. And he reached under the other fingernail and made a 2nd one. And they were neither men nor women, and they were made of nothing at all, and that was the entire point. Because a thing that has no sex and no name and no substance can pass into the land of no return without being noticed, and can come out again, since the rule applies only to those who have properly gone in. He gave one of them the food of life and the other the water of life, and he gave them their instructions, and the instructions are the most surprising part of the whole poem. He did not tell them to fight, he did not tell them to trick anyone or steal anything. He said, "Go down, and you will find the queen of the underworld lying there, uncovered, in labour, groaning. And when she groans and says, 'Oh, my inside,' you say to her, 'Oh, your inside.' And when she says, 'Oh, my outside,' you say, 'Oh, your outside.' Repeat everything she says back to her, and agree with her, and do not ask for anything. And she will be so astonished at being answered that she will offer you a gift. And when she does, refuse everything she offers. Refuse the river with its water. Refuse the field with its grain, and ask only for the corpse hanging on the hook." So they went down, in through the cracks of the door like flies, and they found her exactly as he said, alone, in pain, with nobody attending her, and they sat with her and echoed her, groan for groan, hour after hour. And after a long time she stopped and looked at them and asked who they were, and told them that because they had grieved with her, whoever they were, she would give them a gift. And they refused the river, they refused the field, they asked for the meat that hangs from the hook. And she gave it, because she had said she would, and the word that has gone out of the mouth cannot be brought back. And they sprinkled the food of life and the water of life on the corpse 60 times, and Inanna stood up. But the underworld does not give anything away for nothing, and this is where the poem turns from a rescue into something much sadder and much more interesting. The judges stopped her at the door. "Nobody," they said, "has ever ascended from here unmarked. If you wish to go up, provide someone in your place." And they sent a company of demons with her to make sure the substitution was made, and the poem describes them with a horrible precision. They know no food and no drink. They eat no offering and drink no libation. They accept no gift. They take the wife from a man's lap. They take the child from a nurse's breast. They have no joy in anything. And so Inanna came back up through the 7 gates into the light with that escort at her shoulder, and went looking for someone to leave behind. She came first to a city where a god who served her was sitting in the dust in mourning, in sackcloth, filthy, weeping for her. And the demons said, "This one, let us take him." And she said no. "He mourned for me. He is not the one." She came to a second city and found a second god in the dust, in rags, weeping, and again the demons offered, and again she said no, "He grieved for me. Leave him." And then she came home to her own city, to Uruk, and she went to the great apple orchard, and there on a magnificent throne, in a splendid garment, was her husband Dumuzi, the shepherd. He was not in mourning. He was not sitting in the dust. He had not torn his clothes, or beaten a drum, or gone to a single god on her behalf. He was sitting on her throne in fine clothes, enjoying the weather. And the poem says that she looked at him, and it was the eye of death, and she spoke to him, and it was the word of wrath. And she cried out, "Take him, take this one away." And the demons took him. What happens next is a long chase, and it is genuinely upsetting to read, because Dumuzi is not a villain, and the poem knows it. He runs. He weeps and lifts his hands to the sun god, his brother-in-law, and says, "I am your friend's husband. I am your sister's husband. Change my hands into the hands of a snake. Change my feet into the feet of a snake. Let me escape." And the sun, who is the judge and who has been listening, does it, twice, and twice Dumuzi gets away, and twice they find him again. And he runs to his sister Geshtinanna, whose name means the vine of heaven, and she hides him, and the demons come and offer her the river and the field to give him up, and she refuses, and they torture her, and she does not tell them. And in the end they find him anyway in the sheepfold, and they take him. And then, right at the end, when everything is lost, Geshtinanna goes to the underworld herself and offers to take his place, and the arrangement that is finally made is the arrangement that the whole poem has been walking toward. Half the year the shepherd is below and his sister is above, and half the year the sister is below, and the shepherd is above, and neither of them is ever free, and neither of them is ever entirely gone. And Inanna, who caused all of it, is the one who pronounces the sentence, and there is one line in the very last section where she weeps for him. That is the story that country told about why the year has two halves. Not a myth about crops exactly, though it is that too, the shepherd going down when the pastures burn off in the killing heat of the southern summer, and coming back when they green again. It is a story about love that includes a death sentence, and a sister who volunteers, and a bargain that nobody wins, and it was sung and wept over in that country for 2,000 years. In the month named after him, women went out into the streets and mourned for the shepherd, publicly, ritually, as though for a real man who had really died, and the sound of that mourning was still going on in the cities of the Near East so long afterward that it is complained about in the Hebrew Bible by name, more than 1,000 years after the last Sumerian speaker had died. The other side of Inanna, the bright side, was the sacred marriage, and it belongs in the same breath. Every new year, in the great city, there was a rite in which the king took the part of the shepherd, and a priestess took the part of the goddess, and the two of them were joined, and the country's fertility for the coming year was understood to be secured by it. The songs written for that ceremony are extraordinary, and they are, without any exaggeration, the oldest love poetry in the world. They are frank and unembarrassed, and full of agricultural imagery of the kind that makes modern readers cough. He is the ploughman and she is the field. He is the one who waters and she is the well-watered ground. Her lap is honey. Her vulva is a boat of heaven. Her breasts are a field. Come, my beloved, and let us do it again. And braided all through the frankness is something surprisingly tender. A woman's voice saying plainly that she has washed and dressed and combed her hair and is standing at the door waiting, and that she is happy. 4,000 years, and the wanting sounds exactly the same. And this, finally, is why the last of our 7 ended up owning the Skyfather's temple, because she was the one that people could put a whole life into. You do not have a relationship with the sky. You do not chat with the storm. But a young woman who is beautiful and furious and impatient, who wants everything, who takes what she is not given, who goes to the one place you are not supposed to go and comes back with the ruin of it hanging on her, who loves badly and grieves anyway, who is the first thing you see in the evening and the last thing you see in the morning, that is a god you can talk to at 3 a.m. And they did. There is a poem written for her by a real named human being that we will come to shortly, and it may be the single most remarkable document in this whole 3,000-year story, because it is the first piece of writing in the history of the world whose author signs their own name. Before we go to that poem, let us give the 2 quiet ones their hour, because the moon and the sun have been waiting patiently at the edge of this story, and they are, in the end, the 2 gods that ordinary people met most often. Go down to It sat near the old coast, on a branch of the western river that has long since dried and moved away, so that today the ruins stand in flat desert, with no water in sight at all, which is one of the strangest sights in the world. In its great age the city had a harbour, and quays, and warehouses full of copper ingots and stone and timber that had come up the gulf, and streets of 2-story courtyard houses with plastered walls, and a wall around the whole thing, and rising above it, the ziggurat of the moon, the best preserved of all of them. A mountain of brick 60 feet high, with 3 great stairways of 100 steps meeting at a landing. And above that another terrace, and above that the shrine. It is still there. The lower stages still stand, restored, and the brickwork of the original core is still visible in places, and it is 4,100 years old, and you can walk up the stairs. The moon god's service at was the most prestigious religious office in the country, and it was usually held by a woman. She was called the High Priestess, and she was very often the daughter of the reigning king, and she lived in a walled compound beside the ziggurat called the House of the Woman, and she was, in the ideology of the cult, the moon god's wife. This was not a symbolic sinecure. She managed an estate with thousands of workers, granaries, herds, weavers, fishermen and orchards. She conducted the calendar. She was buried when she died with tremendous ceremony, and successive kings for more than 500 years appointed their daughters to the post, because holding meant holding the moon, and holding the moon meant your dynasty was legitimate in the south. And the calendar itself was her business, and it is worth pausing on because it is the moon god's real monument. The month began at the first sighting of the new crescent, low in the west after sunset. And a month is either 29 or 30 days depending on the moon's own arithmetic, and 12 of those months come to about 354 days, which is 11 days short of a solar year. 11 days a year does not sound like much, but after 3 years you are a month out, and after 9 years you are sowing in what the calendar says is harvest time, and in a country where the whole civilization runs on getting barley into the ground at the right moment. That is not acceptable. So they added a month, not on a fixed rule at first, but by decision. The king or the priesthood would announce that this year there would be a second 12th month, and letters survive giving the instruction, plain administrative notes telling a governor that an extra month has been intercalated this year and to adjust the accounts accordingly. Out of that practical fiddling, century after century, came the astronomy that country became famous for, and eventually the discovery, written down in that language on clay, that the whole pattern of intercalation repeats itself every 19 years, which is a fact still built into more than one calendar in the world tonight. And out of the same watching came the division of the circle into 360 parts, and the hour into 60 minutes, and the minute into 60 seconds, because they counted in 60s, and because 60 divides so beautifully by so many things. Look at a clock tomorrow morning. It is a Sumerian object. Then there is the sun. Utu rose out of the eastern mountain every morning, and crossed and went down into the western one, and at night, in one strand of belief, he went on through the underworld, still shining, and gave judgment there as well, so that even the dead in the dark got a little light and a little law once a day. And because he was the God of judgment, an enormous amount of ordinary human life ran through him. Contracts were sworn before him. Oaths in legal disputes were taken in his temple, and the taking of the oath was often the end of the case. In Mesopotamian law, if the accused was willing to go into the temple and swear before the sun, the matter was frequently considered closed, because nobody was believed to be reckless enough to perjure himself in front of something that had seen him do it. There are records of people simply declining to take the oath at the last moment, in the doorway, and losing the case there and then, which is as human a document as anything that has ever survived. And the great law codes came out of this. There were several over the centuries, the earliest we have, from more than 4,000 years old, and others after it, and then the famous one, carved on a pillar of black stone more than 7 feet high, in a language descended from the same tradition, by a king of Babylon whose name has become shorthand for law itself. That pillar is worth seeing in the mind's eye, because it is a beautiful object, a tall finger of polished black diorite, with a relief carved at the top showing the king standing in prayer before the seated sun god, who is holding out the rod and the ring, the measuring tools, and below that relief, covering the whole rest of the stone, front and back, top to bottom, nearly 300 laws in neat columns of cuneiform. If a man has accused another and cannot prove it, the accuser shall be put to death. If a builder builds a house, and the house falls and kills the owner, the builder shall be put to death. If a man has hired an ox, and it has died through neglect, he shall replace ox for ox. If a woman has been left by her husband for years without support, she may go to another house, and there shall be no blame on her. It is fierce, and it is uneven, and it treats a nobleman's injury as worth more than a commoner's, and it is also, unmistakably, an attempt to write down in advance what will happen, so that outcomes do not depend on who is angriest in the room. The prologue says that the king was called by the gods to make justice appear in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evil, so that the strong might not oppress the weak. That phrase, so that the strong might not oppress the weak, appears again and again in that country's royal inscriptions across 2,000 years, from Sumerian city governors to Babylonian emperors. Whether they meant it is a different question, and mostly the answer is only sometimes, but they wrote it down, on stone, in public, in a plaza where anybody could go and look, and the standard was thereby set where it could be quoted back at them, and it was, and it has been ever since. Now all of that is the religion of the state, the 7 great gods and their houses and their estates and their calendars. But there was another religion going on underneath it at the same time, much smaller and much closer, and it is the one I would most like to leave with you tonight, because it is genuinely lovely. Every person in that country had a personal god. Not one of the 7. A small one, a household one, often inherited from your father, sometimes described as your god and your goddess together. And the relationship with them was nothing like the awe you owed the storm. It was more like having a patron or a relative in the administration. Your personal god's job was to stand up for you. Because the great gods were enormous and busy, and an ordinary person's petition would never reach them on its own, it had to be carried in by somebody who had standing in the household. So your god went in and spoke on your behalf. And if things went well for you, it was because he had been diligent. And if things went badly, it was, very often, because he had turned away, or had gone off in a huff, or, most poignantly of all, because he had simply become inattentive. There is a whole genre of prayer whose entire content is, "My God, where have you gone? Come back, look at me again." And the seals people wore around their necks show this. The common scene, carved into a little cylinder of stone the size of a thumb joint and rolled across wet clay to sign a document, is not a picture of a battle or a monster. It is a picture of the seal's owner being led gently by the wrist by a smaller deity toward a larger seated one. Somebody taking you in and introducing you. Millions of those little stones were carved, and that image is on a great many of them, and it means that the thing an ordinary Sumerian most wanted, carved on the object that stood for their own identity, was, "I have someone who will speak for me." Alongside this ran a whole practical world of managing misfortune. If you were ill, or unlucky, or troubled by dreams, you did not usually conclude that a great god had condemned you. You concluded that something had got in, or that some small ritual fault had left you unprotected, and you sent for a man who knew the correct words. Those specialists left behind libraries, incantations against headache, against fever, against the demon who attacks women in childbirth, against the ghost of a person who died without descendants and is wandering, against a curse laid by a neighbour. Some of them are pure poetry. There is one against toothache that begins with the creation of the universe and works its way patiently down through heaven and earth and rivers and marshes to a worm crying before the sun god, asking to be given a place to live, and being offered ripe figs and apricots, and refusing, and asking instead to be allowed to live among the teeth and the gums. And the incantation ends by telling the worm that because it has said this, the god will smite it with his mighty hand. And then there is a note at the bottom of the tablet, in a completely different tone, giving the practitioner the practical instructions. Mix beer, a malt plant and oil together, recite the incantation 3 times, and apply the mixture to the tooth. Poetry and pharmacy on the same piece of clay, 4,000 years old, dealing with an entirely modern problem at 2 a.m. And there were letters. This is the detail that always undoes me. People wrote letters to their gods, on clay, in the ordinary format of a business letter, addressed and everything, and left them in the temple. To such and such my God speak, thus says your servant. And then the complaint. I have not neglected you. I have made the offerings. Why is my hand sick? Why has my income failed? Why do the people who are worse than me prosper? Look at me. There is a famous one from a young man to his personal god that is essentially a well-argued letter of grievance to an employer who has stopped answering. And there is another famous one, not to a god but from a schoolboy at a distant city to his mother, which is a masterpiece of a different kind. He tells her that the son of a man of lesser rank than his father has 2 new sets of clothes, while he, her own son, has one, and that his mother evidently loves him less than that boy's mother loves him. 4,000 years. The exact same letter is being written tonight. Their afterlife, as we said, was not a reward and not a punishment, and this shaped everything about how they lived. Since there was no better world coming, this one was where the good things were, and Sumerian literature is very clear-eyed about that. In the oldest long poem, the hero, wild with grief at the death of his friend and terrified of his own end, goes across the world to find the man who survived the flood and ask him how to live forever. And along the way he meets a woman who keeps an alehouse at the edge of the sea, and she gives him the only honest advice in the poem. In one old version she says, "The life you are looking for you will never find. When the gods created mankind, they kept life for themselves and gave death to us. So fill your belly and make merry day and night, and dance and play. Keep your clothes clean and your head washed. Bathe in water. Look at the child who holds your hand, and let your wife delight in your embrace. For this too is the lot of man." That is the oldest surviving version of that thought in any literature, and it is a barmaid who says it. And the hero does not take her advice, and he goes on, and he fails, and at the end he comes home and looks at the wall of his city, and that is the poem. And I would like to say one more thing about their dark before we go on, because it is a comfort of a particular kind. The Sumerian dead were not alone, and they were not being judged. They were in a large quiet house, in the dim, with everyone they had ever known, and the worst thing that could happen there was thirst. And thirst could be fixed by a living person remembering to pour out water. That is why the family mattered so much. That is why the dead were sometimes kept under the floor of the sitting room. In that world, remembering somebody was not an emotion, it was a supply line. And the smallest act of remembering, a jar of water tipped onto the ground at the right time of year while saying a name, was understood to reach all the way down into the dark and be drunk. Let us stay in that ordinary world a little while longer, because it is warm in there, and because a year under those 7 gods had a shape to it that is very pleasant to lie down inside. The year began in the spring, at the new moon nearest the barley harvest, and the great festival that opened it lasted for days. The statues came out, the boats went along the canals with awnings and music. There was bread and roast meat and enormous quantities of beer, and the whole city ate on the gods' account. Then the months turned. There was a month for the barley, and a month for the bricks, when the water was low and the mud was right, and everybody in the country who was going to build anything that year made their bricks and set them out in rows to dry, tens of thousands of them. A whole month of the calendar named after the smell of wet clay in the sun. There was the month of the shepherd's mourning in the killing heat, when the pastures burned brown and the women went out and wept for the one who had gone down. There was a month for the eating of the gazelles. There was the month when the fields were open to the water. And through all of them, every 29 or 30 days, the small private punctuation of the new crescent, the day when the moon was invisible, which was a slightly anxious day and a day of rest for some people, and then the evening when somebody on a roof said, "There," and everybody looked west and saw the thin bright fingernail lying on its back in the afterglow. And the month began again. Their food was better than you might think. Barley bread, of course, endlessly in many shapes, and barley porridge and dates, which were everywhere and which they ate fresh and dried and pressed into cakes and boiled into syrup. Fish from the canals, dozens of named kinds, dried and salted and stewed. Onions, garlic leeks, cucumbers, lettuce, chickpeas, lentils, mutton for those who could get it, and pork more often than the later religions of that region would approve of, cheese and butter from the herds, sesame oil for cooking, and honey when it could be had. There survive 3 tablets covered in recipes, nearly 4,000 years old, and they are real recipes, terse and professional, assuming a trained cook, take the meat, prepare water, add fat. Sear the leek and the garlic, mash them and add them, and serve. One of them describes a bird stew with a crust of dough laid over it, which is a pie. And beer, above all beer, which in that country was less a luxury than a form of bread. It was thick and slightly sour and nutritious, and drunk through a straw from a communal jar to get past the floating husks. And it was issued as wages by the temple in fixed daily rations, so many jars a day to a senior official, so many to a labourer. There is a hymn to the goddess of beer that is simultaneously a hymn and a working brewing recipe, in which the mash is described as the waves rising and falling, and the fermenting vat makes a pleasant sound, and the drinkers at the end are in a blissful mood with joyful livers. And there was music. This is the part people least expect. The graves at the extraordinarily rich ones from before the flood of history properly begins, contained lyres, large standing instruments with sound boxes decorated in shell and lapis and gold, one of them with the head of a bearded bull on the front, its beard made of lapis, its eyes made of shell, and the whole thing so magnificent that when the excavators found the wood had rotted entirely away, they poured plaster into the hollow left in the soil and brought the shape of a 4,500-year-old harp up out of the ground. Beside them lay the musicians. We have tablets listing the tuning of stringed instruments, string by string, in a sequence that describes a system of 7 note scales, which means that a form of the diatonic idea was written down in that country 1,000 years before Pythagoras, and there is one tablet, damaged and argued over for 50 years, that appears to be an actual piece of notated music, a hymn, with words and something very like harmony indicated underneath. People have recorded reconstructions of it. Nobody can be certain it is right. But the possibility stands that the oldest written song in the world is a quiet hymn from a small city on that plain, and that it is playable. Women in that world had a narrower field than men, and a wider one than they would have in many places later. They could own property, and did. They appear in the tablets as parties to contracts in their own names, as creditors, as witnesses, as owners of houses and of fields, as taverners, as weavers in the great temple workshops which employed thousands of them, as scribes in a few documented cases, as physicians, and, at the very top, as high priestesses running enormous estates. A marriage contract might specify what happened to the wife's property if the marriage ended, and the law codes give a divorced or abandoned woman certain rights of maintenance. And there is a clause in one of them that says, if a woman has been left without support for a certain number of years, she may take another husband and no claim shall be made against her. That is not equality, and nobody should pretend it is. But it is a written system that recognized her as a person with things and expectations of her own, and it is 4,000 years old. And over the whole plain, all year, was the water and the work of the water. This is the thing that structured every life. The canals had to be maintained or the country died, and maintaining them was not optional and not individual. A length of channel is only as good as the neighbour's length upstream. And the silt has to be dug out every year by everybody, and the levees have to be raised, and when a breach opens in the flood season the whole village goes out at night with baskets and reeds and stops it. Corv labour, the obligation to give so many days a year to the canals, appears in the records constantly, and men are recorded being conscripted to it and occasionally running away from it. But it is also the reason those cities existed. Nobody digs a 50-mile canal alone. The gods, the temple, the accounts, the king, the calendar, the whole apparatus we have been walking through tonight, all of it grew out of the plain fact that the water had to be moved, and no household could move it by itself. Civilization in that country was a drainage arrangement that got out of hand and became beautiful. Let us come back up now into the daylight of history, where there are kings with dates attached to them, and let us walk forward through the actual centuries. Slowly, because the 7 gods we have been visiting were not standing still while all this happened. They were being carried along by it. There is a document copied out over and over by scribes in the schools called the King List, and it begins with a sentence we have already met. When kingship came down from heaven, kingship was at Eridu, and then it names the kings of Eridu and how long each of them reigned, and the numbers are enormous. 28,000 years, 36,000 years, and after a while it says that Eridu was abandoned and kingship was carried to another city, and there are more kings with impossible reigns, and then that city fell and it was carried on again. Until, after 8 kings in 5 cities and a total of 241,000 years, the list says, in one flat line, then the flood swept over. And after the flood swept over, kingship again came down from heaven. And then the reigns begin to shrink. The kings after the flood rule for 1,200 years, then for 400, then for 100, then for 36. And by the time you get to the end of the list, the reigns are perfectly ordinary human lengths, and the kings are people we can confirm from other documents. It is the oldest history of the world ever compiled, and if you read it as a whole rather than in pieces, it does something quite deliberate. It shows time itself coming down out of legend into the human scale, like a bird landing. And roughly a third of the way down that list, in the city of Uruk in the section just after the flood, there is a name given 5 different ways in different manuscripts, and the reign attached to it is 126 years, and the entry notes that his father was a spirit. The name is Gilgamesh. He was, almost certainly, an actual man. There is a separate and much drier document, an inscription about the building of a temple, that names a king of Uruk of that name, and there is a reference in another early text to the wall of Uruk being his work, and the wall was real. You can still trace its circuit in the desert, 6 miles around, enclosing an area larger than classical Athens. A king of that city in that era would have been, in life, a warlord with a few thousand men and a very large brick problem. And out of him, over the following 1,000 years, the region built the first great work of literature on earth. It grew slowly, in pieces, in Sumerian first as a set of separate poems about a hero doing famous things. And then, centuries later, somebody in Babylon took those scattered poems and made them into a single continuous epic in 11 tablets. And then somebody else added a 12th, and the version that most people read today is credited on the tablets themselves to a named editor, a scholar and exorcist, which makes it the oldest work of literature in the world with an editor's name on the cover. And what is it about? It begins as an adventure story about a king who is too strong and too arrogant, and the gods make a wild man out of clay to be his equal and check him, and the two of them fight and then become inseparable friends, and they go off together and kill a monster in a cedar forest, and Inanna offers herself to the king and he refuses her, insultingly, listing all her previous lovers and what happened to each of them, and she goes up to heaven in a rage and demands the bull of heaven from her father, which brings us right back to that scene we met earlier where the Sky Father says no and she threatens to open the underworld. And they kill the bull too. And then the gods hold a council and decide that for the monster and the bull, one of the two friends must die, and it is not the king. And the second half of the poem is about grief. It stops being an adventure entirely. The king sits with the body of his friend for 6 days and 7 nights until, in one of the most terrible lines ever written, a worm falls out of its nose, and then he goes out into the wilderness, dressed in skins, unwashed, and wanders. And everyone he meets asks him why his cheeks are hollow and his face is like that of a man who has come a long way, and each time he gives the same answer, that his friend, who chased the wild ass and the panther of the plain, has turned to clay, and that he is afraid of death, and that he will not lie down. That is the oldest long poem we have. Not a hymn, not a war record, not a genealogy. A book about a man who cannot accept that his friend is dead, written down 5,000 years ago by a people who made the first cities, and who put it in the school curriculum, so that generation after generation of 10-year-olds learning to press wedges into clay had to copy out the passage about the worm, and the passage about the alewife, and the passage at the end where the hero comes home. With nothing, and looks at his city wall and says, "Go up and walk on it, examine the foundation, inspect the brickwork. Did not the 7 sages lay its foundations?" Around this same era, the early cities of the plain were doing what cities that are close together and both want the same water have always done. There is a boundary dispute between 2 neighbouring city-states. over a stretch of good irrigated farmland between them that is documented on both sides across 5 generations and roughly a century and a half, and it is the oldest border war in recorded history. There are treaties. There is an arbitration conducted by a king from a third city acting as a neutral party who set up a stone marker on the agreed line. There are subsequent inscriptions accusing the other side of pulling the marker out and burning it. There is a battle commemorated on a carved stone slab showing a phalanx of soldiers advancing with locked shields and levelled spears, which is the earliest depiction of that formation anywhere and predates the Greek version by 2,000 years. And there is, at the end of it, on the losing side eventually, a reforming ruler who left an inscription complaining about the state his city had got into, that the temple officials had been taking the donkeys and the good garments, that the priests were charging the poor extortionate fees to bury their dead, that the palace had encroached on the god's land, that the tax collectors were everywhere from one end of the territory to the other, and he says he made a covenant with the god that the widow and the orphan would not be delivered up to the powerful man. That inscription is more than 4,300 years old, and it is generally described as the first recorded reform program in history, and it did not save him. A few years later, a king from the next city along came and burned his capital and the god's temple with it, and the scribe who recorded that event wrote that the men of the other city had committed a sin against the goddess, and that the punishment for it would be theirs and not his master's. And then, out of the north, came the man who ended the whole system of independent cities, and he did not come from a royal family at all. His name means the true king, which is exactly the sort of name a man gives himself, and the legend he left behind about his own origins is one of the oldest and most durable stories in the world, that his mother was a priestess who bore him in secret, and set him in a basket of reeds sealed with pitch, and put him on the river, and the river carried him to a man who drew water, who lifted him out and raised him as his own, and made him a gardener. And from the garden, the legend says, the goddess loved him, and he became a cupbearer to a king, and then he became the king, and then he became the master of everything between the 2 rivers. He built a new capital whose site has never been found, and which is one of the great missing cities of archaeology, and from it he ruled the first empire in history, holding the old Sumerian cities of the south together with the Semitic-speaking north under one administration for the first time. He put his own governors in the cities. He made his own language, which was not Sumerian, an official language beside it, and from that moment the country is bilingual and will remain so, and Sumerian will slowly cease to be spoken by anyone at home, while continuing to be written by everyone in a temple for another 2,000 years, the way Latin behaved in Europe. And he did one more thing, which is more interesting than any of his conquests. He appointed his daughter as High Priestess of the Moon at Ur. This was a political move. Put your own child in the holiest office of the conquered South, and the South's own gods will be seen to have blessed you. Kings did it for the next 500 years, because he did it first. But the daughter turned out to be one of the most consequential human beings in the history of writing. Her name was Enheduanna. She held that office in the City of the Moon for decades, through her father's reign and into the reigns of her nephews, and she was at one point driven out of it by a rebellion and later restored. And she wrote. She composed a set of hymns to the temples of the country, 42 of them, one for each of the great sanctuaries, a kind of poetic gazetteer of the whole religious landscape of Sumer. And it was copied and recopied in the schools for centuries. And she wrote 3 long poems to Inanna, and in the greatest of them, a poem usually called The Exaltation of the Lady, she does something no one had ever done before on a piece of clay. She puts herself in it. She writes about her own exile. She says that she has been driven from the temple, made to walk in the thorny scrub, that the man who did it stripped her of her office and sent her out of the sanctuary at knife point, that she stands in the light of day and does not know where to go, that she who once made offerings now cannot even lift her hands, and she pleads with the goddess to notice, and she says, and this is the line, I am yours. And then, in the middle of the poem, she names herself. I am Enheduanna, she writes. This is my composition. And with that, 4,300 years ago, in a temple compound beside a brick mountain in a city that is now dry desert, authorship begins. Every writer since has been doing something she did first. Her father's empire lasted about 150 years, which is not long, and it ended. And how it ended became one of the country's great cautionary poems. There is a composition called The Curse of Akkad, and its argument is precisely the one you would expect from everything we have said tonight about the Stormlord and the Assembly. A later king of that dynasty, the poem says, grew impatient with the god at Nippur. He wanted an answer from the oracle, and the answer did not come, or did not please him, and so he took an army north to Nippur, and he did the unthinkable. He laid hands on the house of the mountain. He put ladders against it. He took axes to it. He carried away its treasure and broke its gates and dug into it as though it were an ordinary building. And the poem says the great gods took counsel, and in return for the temple's ruin they brought down out of the eastern mountains a people the poem describes with genuine horror, a people who are not classed among the country, who have the instincts of dogs and the features of monkeys, and they came down onto the plain, and the roads grew grass, and the caravans stopped. And the fields gave no grain, and the price of a small measure of barley rose to a level the poem records exactly, so that the whole thing reads, at the end, like a famine report. And the last section is a formal curse laid on the city itself, that its canals should carry only water that is bitter, that anyone looking for arable land should find only reed beds, that its clay should be the clay of the pit, and, most cutting of all, for a place like that no one should build there again. And nobody has. The capital of the first empire in history has never been located. Whether the poem is history or theology is beside the point. The point is that the people of that country believed, and wrote down, that the greatest empire they had ever seen was destroyed because a king lost his temper with a temple, and they taught that lesson to their children in school for 1,000 years afterward. After the empire fell apart, there was a scattered century, and then the South gathered itself for one last and most brilliant time, and this is the age that produced almost everything we have been reading tonight. It is called the Third Dynasty of Ur, and it lasted only about 100 years, and in those 100 years the Sumerian language had its final flowering as a living literature, and the whole of the country was run as one enormous, meticulously documented estate. The first king of it rebuilt Ur, and he is the one who raised the great ziggurat of the moon whose lower stages you can still climb. He issued the earliest law code we possess, 3 centuries before the famous Black Pillar, and its penalties are notably milder. Where the later code will demand an eye for an eye, this one imposes fines in silver, so many shekels for a broken bone, so many for a lost tooth, which some scholars read as a sign that the older southern tradition was less bloody-minded than what came after. And he dug canals, and he built the walls, and he was killed in battle against a people from the eastern mountains, abandoned on the field, and there survives a poem about his death that is startling in its bitterness. It says that the great gods had promised him, and then reneged. It says that Enlil deceived him. It describes the dead king arriving in the underworld with his chariot and his weapons, and giving out his lavish gifts to the 7 judges, and then sitting down in the dark and weeping, not for himself, but because the walls of Ur were unfinished, because the new palace was not done, because his wife would not be held again, and his son would not be lifted on his knee. Even the state poetry of that country, written for a royal funeral, is willing to look straight at the fact that a good king can do everything right and be lied to by heaven. His son ruled for 48 years and is one of the most extraordinary administrators in the ancient world. Under him, the kingdom was reorganized into provinces with governors and a standardized system of weights, measures, and accounting so thorough that the archives from his reign and the reigns after him have produced something on the order of 100,000 tablets, most of them accounts, not literature. Receipts, deliveries of reeds, rations of barley and oil issued to named workers, the daily record of a livestock redistribution centre that handled tens of thousands of animals a year, noting each one, dead or alive, fat or thin, by name of the herdsman who brought it. It is the most completely documented economy of the ancient world, and reading the summaries of it is a peculiarly restful experience, because what you are looking at is an entire civilization keeping its books in perfect order 2,000 years before anybody thought of the number 0. He also, and this is where he becomes personally interesting, founded schools. The scribal academies of that age are where the Sumerian classics were fixed in the form we have them. The flood story, the descent of Inanna, the poems of the exiled priestess, the hymns to the temples, all of it copied and copied by students. And the copies that survive are largely school exercises. Some of the tablets have a teacher's model on one side and a shaky student attempt on the other. Some have the same line written out 15 times, getting steadily better. There are compositions about school life, comic dialogues in which a boy is late and is caned again for talking, and goes home and persuades his father to invite the teacher to dinner and give him a new garment and a ring, after which the teacher praises the boy extravagantly. There is a father's furious lecture to a lazy son that would go straight into a modern novel. Why do you loiter in the public square? Why do you not go to school, go to your teacher, recite your assignment? I never in my life sent you to carry reeds. I never said go and work in the fields. I never made you plough. Other boys support their parents by working and you do not. And are you a man? 4,000 years. And the king himself claimed, in his own hymns, that he could read and write, and that he could do the mathematics, and that he had been trained in the scribal school like anybody else, and that he could compose a hymn and perform it, and that he could run 180 miles between 2 cities in a single day, and conduct the festival at both ends. That last one is a boast. But the literacy claim is probably true, and it is rare. Most kings in most centuries of that country were proudly illiterate and employed people to read for them. And around the whole flourishing thing, they built a wall. Not a city wall. A long wall, 100 miles or more of it, across the neck of the plain between the 2 rivers in the north, to keep out a people from the western desert whom the texts describe with the usual condescension of a settled bureaucracy toward a mobile one. People who do not know grain, who do not bury their dead, who eat raw meat, who live in tents and dig for truffles at the foot of the hills, who know no house. It was called the wall that keeps out the Western people. And within 1 generation of its completion, the Western people were inside it, not as an invasion but as they had always come, in 1s and 2s and families, taking work, herding, settling on the edges, being hired into the army, appearing in the tablets first as labourers and then as officers, and then as officials with Sumerian titles and Western names. You cannot wall out a slow migration. Nobody ever has. And the end, when it came, was not dramatic at first. It was economic and it was administrative, and it happened over about 20 years, in the reign of the last king, and you can watch it happening in the accounts, which is the most chilling way to watch anything happen. The tablets from the outer provinces stop. Not violently, they simply stop being sent in, 1 province after another, as governors decide that the centre is no longer worth answering. Then the price of grain in the surviving records begins to climb, and it climbs by a factor of 60 over a few years, which is famine arithmetic. There are letters from that period, or literary letters modelled closely on that period, in which an official writes to the king that the enemy has been coming in, that the harvest has been carried off, that the roads are cut, that he cannot get the grain through, and that the king should send help, and other letters back, telling him to hold on. And then the people from the eastern mountains came down and took Ur, and burned it, and carried the last king away east in chains, and he was never heard of again. And the survivors wrote a poem about it. This is the poem I promised you earlier, and it is called The Lamentation over the Destruction of Ur. And it is, I think, the greatest thing that country produced, and it is not comfortable. And I want to give it to you gently, because it ends better than it begins. It opens with the gods walking out. That is the first movement, and it is done as a long, slow, deliberately repetitive list. The god has abandoned his house. He has left his stable, his sheepfold is given to the wind. The lord of the shining house has abandoned it. The shepherd has left. City after city, sanctuary after sanctuary, temple after temple, the same line repeated with a different name in it, 20 and 30 times over, until the effect is like watching every light in a city go out one window at a time. And then the goddess of the moon god's wife, the great lady of the city, goes up to the assembly of the gods and pleads for her city, and it is the finest scene of its kind ever written. She says, "Let not my city be destroyed, I say to them. Let not be destroyed, I say to them. Let not its people be killed, I say to them." And Enlil answers her, and his answer is that was indeed given kingship, but that it was not given an eternal reign, and that since time immemorial, since the country was founded, no one has ever seen a term of kingship that has come to an end. And she throws herself down. The poem says that she, the great lady, threw her legs and arms down before them like a fallen ox, and that she plucked at her heart, and that she wept, and that it did no good at all, because the word that has gone out of the mouth cannot be brought back. And then the storm comes, and it is described as a storm because the poem cannot bear to describe it as an army, and both are true. The great storm from the horizon, the storm that annihilates the land, the storm that has no mother and no father, the storm that does not know pity. It blows the doors down, it fills the streets. The poem, having been abstract for 100 lines, becomes suddenly and unbearably specific. The dead lay in the streets like potsherds. The walls were breached and people lay there, where the festival crowds used to gather, heads lay scattered. The blood of the land filled its holes like metal in a mould. The old men who did not leave their houses were consumed by fire. The infants lying at their mothers' breasts were carried off like fish. The nursemaids let the babies slip from their arms. Mothers and fathers who did not leave their houses were overcome by fire. The city became strange to itself, and the very worst detail, the one that only somebody who was there would think to write down, the poem says that even the storehouses were broken open, and that which had had grain in it, became a place where a man could not find bread, and that the Temple of the Moon, the finest building in the world, was made to look like a house that had never been lived in, and that the wind went through it. And then the poem does something that no modern reader ever expects, and it is the reason it survives, and it is the reason I have kept it for the last hour of the night. It does not end there. The last 2 sections are not about the destruction at all. They are a prayer for the god to come back. The poem turns and addresses the moon directly, and it says, in effect, this happened, and it was terrible, and we have described it accurately so that it cannot be pretended otherwise. And now, please, come home. Return to your city. Return to your house. May the storm that has been made to lie upon the land be dispersed. May the people who are scattered be gathered again. May the roads be walked on. And then, in the very last lines, it asks that the storm itself be praised in the temple, that the thing that destroyed the city be given its offering, because it too came from the assembly, and it too must be reckoned with, and that the god, standing in his restored house, should look on his people with favour. That is an astonishing thing to write within living memory of the event. It contains no revenge, it names no enemy king. The people from the mountains barely appear, they are subsumed into the weather. What it does instead is refuse both denial and despair, and then ask plainly for the city to be lived in again. And it was. Was rebuilt within a generation. Kings of the next dynasty restored the ziggurat, and it went on being a working temple for another 1400 years, and a king of Babylon was still repairing it, and appointing his own daughter as high priestess in the ancient manner, so late in the story that Athens by then had already had its golden age. That poem, meanwhile, was copied out by students for centuries in schools all over the country, and it seems to have been part of the standard curriculum, which means that for hundreds of years, in 1,000 small hot rooms, boys learning to write were made to copy, line by line, an exact account of the worst thing that had ever happened to their civilization, followed by a request that the world be made habitable again. There are worse curricula. So Sumer, as a country with its own spoken language and its own kings, was over. And here is the thing that makes this story unlike almost any other ending in ancient history. The gods did not go with it. They kept working for another 2,000 years. What happened instead was slower and much more interesting. The people who now ran the plane spoke a different language, a Semitic one, and they had their own names for many of the same forces. And so the seven were, over several centuries, quietly translated. The moon was still the moon, but he was now called Sin, and his great house at Ur went on standing, and his second great sanctuary in the north, at Haran, became so important that 1,500 years later, the last king of Babylon would be obsessed with it, and would spend a decade of his reign away in the desert restoring it, to the fury of everybody at home. The sun was still the judge, but he was now called Shamash, and it is before him, seated, that the black law pillar shows the king standing. Inanna was now Ishtar, and she grew, if anything, larger. Her cult spread across the entire Near East under a dozen local versions of the name. She acquired new cities and new titles. She became the great goddess of Assyria and its patron in war, and her descent to the underworld was retold in the new language with the seven gates intact. The sweet water god was now Ea, still clever, still in the deep, still the one who warns the man about the boat. The Storm Lord and the Sky Father and the Mother Goddess all continued under names of their own, and into that assembly, around the time when the city of Babylon rose from a modest provincial town to the capital of the world, came a new figure who had barely existed before, and his rise is one of the most instructive stories in the history of religion. His name was Marduk, and he was the local god of Babylon, a nobody in the old lists, and when Babylon became powerful his priests did something that had never quite been done before. They wrote a poem to explain, in cosmic terms, why he should be at the top. That poem, recited every year on the fourth day of the New Year festival, tells how the gods were threatened by an ancient monstrous sea. The primordial mother of them all turned hostile with an army of dragons, and how one by one the great old gods were asked to go out and face her, and one by one they refused or failed. And how at last the young god of Babylon said he would go on one condition, that the assembly should first grant him permanent supremacy, his word to be law, his decree unalterable, and that they should test this by setting a garment among them and having him destroy it and restore it, by speech alone. And they agreed, and he did it, and they proclaimed him king. And then he went out and killed the sea, and split her body in two like a shellfish, and made the sky from one half and the earth from the other, and set the stars in their courses and fixed the year and the months, and made human beings from the blood of the defeated rebel commander so that the gods might rest. And finally the gods built him Babylon as his house, and at the end of the poem they recite his 50 names, one after another, each one a title borrowed from an older god. 50 names. It is an annexation conducted in verse. And it worked. For the next 1,000 years he was, in that part of the world, effectively the chief god of the universe, and the older assembly receded behind him. But notice what did not happen. Nobody said the old gods were false. Nobody smashed the temple at Nippur or at Eridu or at Ur. The new arrangement was presented not as a replacement, but as a promotion agreed by the old council, which is exactly how the country had always imagined authority working. The assembly meets. The assembly decides. The decree is issued. The paperwork is in order. And in the New Year festival at Babylon, the greatest religious event in the ancient Near East, held over 11 days each spring, the whole thing was reenacted. Statues of gods were brought in from other cities by boat and river. The poem was recited. And on one of those days, the king of Babylon, the most powerful man alive, was taken into the inner sanctuary, and the high priest removed his crown and his scepter and his ring and set them aside, and then struck the king across the face, hard enough that tears were expected, and made him kneel and recite a negative confession. I have not sinned, Lord of the lands. I have not been negligent of your divinity, I have not destroyed Babylon, I have not ordered its overthrow, I have not neglected the temple, I have not struck the cheek of a subordinate. And then the priest gave the regalia back and struck him once more. And if the tears came, the god was pleased, and the year would be good. Every single year, in public, in the presence of the assembled gods of the country, the king was slapped and made to account for himself. Whatever else you say about that civilization, it kept that ceremony for a very long time. And meanwhile, north up the river, the Assyrians were building the largest empire the world had yet seen, and one of their kings, a hard and frightening man who was also, unusually a genuine scholar, decided to collect everything. He sent agents out across the country with instructions to find tablets, to go into the old temple libraries and the private houses of exorcists and copy or seize whatever they held, and he assembled at his capital a library of tens of thousands of tablets covering omens, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, incantations, lexicons, and literature, and among them the fullest surviving copy of the epic about the king of Uruk, and his dead friend, and the man who survived the flood. He said in a colophon that he could read the obscure Sumerian that was difficult to master, and that he could read inscriptions from before the flood. And then his empire collapsed in a single violent generation, and his capital was sacked and burned, and the burning baked the clay tablets hard, which is the reason we have them. And now the light in this long house begins, at last, to go down, and the ending is not a catastrophe. That is the surprising part. Nobody destroyed the gods of Sumer. They were not overthrown or forbidden or driven out. What happened to them is much quieter, and much more like what happens to everything, and it takes about 600 years. Babylon fell to the Persians, and the Persians were, by the standards of the age, extremely relaxed about local religion. Their king marched in, and made a point of announcing that he had come at the invitation of the city god, and would restore the neglected sanctuaries, and the temples went on as before, with a new tax authority. Then the Persians fell to Alexander, who arrived at Babylon, and gave orders that the great ziggurat, which had fallen into serious disrepair, should be rebuilt. And the rubble was cleared, and the work was begun, and then he died in that city, in the palace, at 32, and the work stopped, and was never finished. Then his generals divided the world, and the one who got this part built a brand new Greek capital a little way off on the river, and the population of Babylon slowly drained toward it, the way populations do, without anyone deciding. And the temples went on. That is the extraordinary thing. Under Persian kings, under Macedonian kings, under a Greek-speaking administration. In a city that was steadily emptying, the daily service continued. The god was washed and dressed and fed twice a day. The offerings were logged, the festivals were kept, and the astronomers, who were temple staff, went on recording the position of the moon and the planets, and the price of barley, and the height of the river, night after night after night, in the same script on the same clay. For century upon century, producing the longest continuous scientific record in human history, 700 years of nightly observations. The whole later mathematical astronomy of the Greek world sits on top of that record. But the community keeping it was shrinking. Sumerian had not been spoken by anybody for 2,000 years. It was pure scholarship now, like Church Latin. Then the Babylonian language itself stopped being spoken in the streets, replaced by Aramaic, which was written with an alphabet of 22 letters on parchment and papyrus, and could be learned in a season, whereas cuneiform required years of training and 600 signs. Clay and reed lost to ink and skin, on the merits, and the only people who still learned the old script were the priests of a few old temples, because the ritual could not be performed in any other way. And so it narrows and narrows to a handful of families in 2 or 3 sanctuaries, teaching their sons a script that nobody outside the temple can read, to serve gods whose cities are half empty, in an empire that files its taxes in a different language. The last dated cuneiform tablet that we possess is an astronomical almanac. It gives the predicted positions of the planets for a single year. That year corresponds to the year 79 or 80 of our era. There were Roman emperors by then. Pompey had already been buried, and somewhere in the ruins of Babylon an old man who could read a writing system 3,000 years old sat down and calculated where Jupiter would be, and pressed it into clay, and that is the last thing anybody ever wrote in that script. Nobody recorded who he was. Nobody noted that it was the end. It probably did not feel like the end. It probably felt like an ordinary Tuesday with fewer colleagues than there used to be. And then the mud went back to being mud. This is where the story gets, in a strange way, restful, because those cities were built of unfired brick, and unfired brick, when it is no longer maintained, does not fall down dramatically. It slumps. Rain, which comes rarely but comes, softens the tops of the walls, and they wash down and pile up against the bases, and the wind brings dust, and each abandoned building slowly becomes a low mound of its own material, and the mounds merge, and the whole city sinks into a single long hill on the plain, with the shape of streets faintly visible on top of it, if you know how to look. The local word for such a hill is tell, and the plain of the two rivers is covered with them, thousands of them, some enormous. Travellers rode past for centuries and knew perfectly well that they were mounds of old brick, and shepherds grazed sheep on them, and villages were built on their flanks, and nobody knew whose they were, and the names had come loose from the places. The great ziggurat at Ur stood there in the desert with nothing around it, and Bedouin called it the Mound of Pitch. And under it, packed in the collapsed rooms, in the rubbish tips, in the schoolroom floors, in the storerooms, were the tablets. Hundreds of thousands of them. Clay does not rot, it does not burn, or rather burning improves it. It is not worth stealing. It cannot be scraped down and written over, the way parchment could be. Every receipt for 6 sheep, every schoolboy's shaky third attempt at a hymn, every letter from a young man to his God complaining that his hand hurts and his prayers are not being answered, every copy of the poem about the shepherd taken by the demons, was lying there in the dark under the sand. In the exact place where it had been dropped or filed or discarded, perfectly legible, waiting for 2,000 years. And then, in the middle of the 19th century, people began to dig. The script was deciphered, slowly and with a great deal of arguing, from trilingual inscriptions carved high on a cliff in Persia, that a young officer copied by hanging off a ladder over a drop. And once the sounds were known, the tablets began to speak. And in 1872, in London, a young man who had left school at 14 to be apprenticed to a banknote engraver, and who had taught himself the script in his lunch hours at the museum because he could not stop looking at the cases, was sorting through a tray of broken pieces from the burned Assyrian library. And he found himself reading an account of a boat, and a mountain, and a dove sent out that returned, and a raven sent out that did not. He is said to have jumped up and begun taking off his clothes in his excitement, which is the sort of detail that survives, because his colleagues never let him forget it. He read the tablet aloud to a learned society in December of that year, and the newspapers carried it around the world. And the world discovered that a story it had thought unique was older than it had imagined, and had been told in a language nobody had spoken since before the pyramids at Giza were middle-aged. A newspaper paid for him to go out to the mounds and look for the missing piece of the tablet. He went, and, absurdly, within 5 days of digging he found it. On a later expedition, he died of fever on the road at 36, and his notebooks came home without him. And so, one tray at a time, over 150 years, the 7 have come back. Not as gods, nobody is proposing that. As people. We can read the letters they received. We know what their statues were dressed in, garment by garment, because the inventories survive. We know the price of barley on a particular day 4,000 years ago, and the name of the man who delivered it, and the name of the official who signed for it. We know that a woman in the city of Ur wrote to her son about a shipment of copper that turned out to be poor quality and that she was extremely annoyed about it. We know that a schoolboy thought his mother did not love him as much as another boy's mother. We know that when someone had a toothache they told a story about a worm and then put warm beer and oil on it. Hundreds of thousands of these tablets are in museums now, and in one of the quieter facts of modern scholarship, the great majority of them have never been read by anybody, because there are only a few hundred people alive who can read them, and there are far more tablets than there is time. Somewhere tonight, in a drawer, in a numbered tray, in a building with the lights off, there is a small piece of dried river mud with somebody's ordinary business pressed into it. And it has been waiting 4,000 years, and it will wait a little longer, and eventually somebody will pick it up and find out what it says. I find that a genuinely comforting thought at this hour. Nothing is in a hurry, nothing has been lost that was written down, so let us go back where we started, and then let you go. It is night on the plain between the two rivers. The reeds are moving, the water is black and slow and warm, and it is going south, the way it has always gone south, the way it is going right now, tonight, while you lie there. The stepped mountain of brick is still standing at restored, with its 100 steps, and if you climbed it in the dark tonight, you would see the desert going out flat in every direction, and the moon coming up enormous over the place where the harbour used to be. The Sky Father is up above the highest heaven where nobody goes, being invoked at the top of lists. The Storm Lord is out over the plain somewhere, doing what wind does, and he is not thinking about anybody. The Clever One is under the ground in the sweet water, which is still there, which is still sweet, and which people still dig down to and drink from. The Mother of the Stony Ground is out at the edge where the hills begin. The moon is walking his cattle from one horizon to the other, and he has not lost one yet. The sun is under the world, giving judgment in the dark. And the last of them, the restless one, is the bright point low in the west that you can see out of a window on any clear evening for a few months of the year. And she is going down after the sun, and in half a year she will come up before it instead, and she has been doing this the entire time, through Sumer and Akkad and Babylon and Assyria and Persia and Greece and Rome and every single thing that has happened since, and she will be there tomorrow evening whether or not anybody looks. 3,000 years those 7 were fed, twice a day, by hand, in houses built of mud that had to be rebuilt every generation, by people who kept receipts. That is the whole story, and now you have it, and now you can let it go. Let it go the way you let go of the day. Let your breath get long and slow and untidy. Let the room be dark and warm around you. There is nothing left in this story that needs you, and nothing left in the day that needs you either. Everyone in it finished their work an extremely long time ago, and put down their tools and went home, and the wind is going over the mound where they lived, and the water is going south, and it is going to keep going south all night, whether you are awake for it or not. So stop listening now if you like. Let the words become just a sound, the way water is just a sound. Sleep well. Sleep deeply. And may somebody, a very long time from now, still be pouring out a little water and saying your name.